Great. Run up and do our categorize yourselves. This one, yeah, I'll use this one. And then this one, eject. Where's it still? Negative 5 if you want to reject it. No, or you can just copy that. Hello, everyone. It's that time after lunch when everyone is about to fall into food coma, apart from those who've taken coffee. But we have 3 exciting presentations to keep you awake through the difficult next hour and a half. My name is Torsten Reimer. I work at the British Library, and I'll be the chair, although I want to sort of minimize my involvement in this to give presenters as much time as possible for speaking and you time for questions. So just briefly to say, we have 3 presentations. They look at repositories from a national angle, one from Canada and one from Ireland, and then a sort of more international perspective. I'm not going to introduce all the speakers. You will have seen from the program that, technically speaking, we have about 30 of them on all the papers, and that would take quite a while. So I think without further ado, I'll hand over to our colleagues from Canada for the first presentation.
Thanks, Torsten. I'm really regretting wearing my shorts today because it's cold in here. But maybe this will reinvigorate me. Just briefly to introduce myself, many of you may know me with my other hat on, which is the Executive Director of CORE, the Confederation of Open Access Repositories. But I also work as a consultant and research associate with the Canadian Association of Research Libraries, and that's what we'll be talking about today in a project, one of the CARL projects around repositories. My colleague Jeff Harder, I'll let you introduce yourself when you come on.
Or I could do it.
Okay.
Hi everyone, I'm Jeff Harder. I'm Associate University Librarian at the University of Alberta, and part of the reason why I'm up here is I'm one of the co-chairs of the Canadian Association of Research Libraries Open Repository Working Group. We're going to have to adjust the mic up and down for us.
Okay, so I just wanted to briefly introduce the context for a kind of movement from a very institutional approach in Canada around building repositories to a more strategic and national approach. And like many of you, especially I think in the United States, we had a lot of institutional repositories in Canada. Each institution had their own repository, but we weren't really working collectively together very well or talking a lot. And that meant that we weren't making nearly as much progress around systemic change as we think we could have. And so a lot of this discussion was related to some other discussions we have been having at the Canadian Association of Research Libraries about the current situation in scholarly communication and how somewhat unhappy we are about the slow pace of change around open access issues. And so in 2017, CARL prepared, and I was the lead author on this, a scholarly communication roadmap. To try to take, again, a more strategic and cohesive approach around our activities to push change in the system. And so, as I said, a lot of the impetus for this discussion was the fact that we've been working in scholarly communication and in the open access field for a long time, but we feel that things are moving too slowly. So we really sat down and said, what can we do? How can we work better together to change the system? And as you all know, the issues with scholarly communication are really systemic. It's not just that journal prices are too high. It's also that we don't have an option for an alternative for existing the existing journal system. It's related to our reliance on impact factor and other journal-based measures. And so what we decided to do was kind of look at the issues from a systemic perspective and identify the activities that the whole Canadian community could do together to try to change some of these issues. So as I said, we developed a roadmap in 2017, and it has basically 5 aspects to the roadmap. Increasing awareness of the benefits of open access. So this is really advocating and promoting with other stakeholder communities, especially the administrators, funding agencies, and research communities. Promoting and accelerating the adoption of open science policies, and we already have done quite well with our funders in Canada. We have open access policies and data, soon to be data policies coming, but our institutions don't have a lot of policies right now. Lowering the economic barriers to creation and dissemination of academic publications, and this is really focused mainly on trying to be stronger in our licensing negotiations with the publishers and taking more risks around saying we're not going to give you that 2 or 3 or 4% increase every time we come up to a new negotiation. Promoting the responsible application of impact and productivity measures for research. So this is a very difficult one for the library community because we get a lot of pushback when we talk about how our reliance on journal measures is really the crux to the whole system, and how the commercial entities are really able to continue to control the system. And then expanding types of research outputs in formally scholarly communication system. And this is related a lot to our Portage project, which is also a national project to collect research data. So I won't go into the details of this, but each of these 5 areas has a number of activities associated with it. And if you look under number 3, 3.4 is to strengthen and add value to the network of Canadian open access repositories. And again, we've been very active in trying to raise awareness of the unsustainability of the journal costs, and we published this brief, and it was very well accepted and discussed in the higher level administrators in Canada. But the issue is we can't just complain about journal costs. We also have to work on developing an alternative system. And that's where we feel repositories are coming into the picture. So there you have it, 3.4. And that's where the national project around Canadian repositories begins. And I think on that note, I'll turn it over to Jeff.
So with the, so basically picking up on the roadmap and some of the other conversations that had started at the tail end of 2017 is when Carl the Canadian Association of Research Libraries decided to launch their Open Repositories Working Group. So it really picks up on some of the things that Kathleen talked about in terms of strengthening and adding value to the network of existing Canadian open access repositories that we have, as well as bringing other ones on stream as we go along, with the emphasis of really trying to tie together different stakeholder interests to have maximum impact in what we do. So some of you might recognize a few of the names on this list, maybe not, I don't know. But I'm one of the co-chairs of this group with Martha Whitehead, who's at Queen's University. Really important in the formation of the group that we had a variety of different people involved. So this is, on the ground, boots on the ground, open repository managers who are working with researchers on a daily basis. actually trying to, ensure we've got good, strong ingest pipelines for articles and publications and so forth into our repositories, that the assets are being managed well, to people who represent more of the senior administration side of the discussions, where resourcing becomes incredibly important, making sure that we've got we're not just committing with our words, but we're actually committing with our actions and with our dollars. So lots could be done. As Kathleen talked about, with some of the areas that we need to work on, the risks of not moving ahead are significant. So it's really important that we do take action. So the working group has decided to focus in, at least initially, on sort of 4 main areas, which you see on the screen here, and we formed task groups to take a look at each of those. The idea is that the working group, are the leaders, so to speak, for these areas, but we bring in expertise from wherever we can get it across the country with other individuals and organizations. So just to briefly talk about a few of those areas, the one that isn't necessarily technology focused, but is people focused, hugely important, is the community building and awareness group. So we're not trying to reinvent community here. What we want to try to do is we want to build on the really strong community foundations that already exist in Canada. So there are a lot of repository managers and others who are heavily invested in trying to make these systems work. And too often I think it's individuals, heroic individuals, who are working, who are trying to do what they can within a very localized environment, having a challenge trying to connect with other people across a country as big as Canada. So one of the things we wanted to try to do is, let's see what kind of scaffolding we can build around those existing communities to help support them in the important work that's happening there. So we want to take advantage of existing communication tools, for example, that are in place. So and I'm looking at a few folks here who are using things like Slack on a daily basis to be able to communicate with each other. So let's bring the conversations, let's help bring some of the Carl planning to where the communities already are, as opposed to expecting the communities to go elsewhere. We want to begin to look more closely at strategic areas like the Next Generations report that CORE has produced. And it has a lot of things that as a repository community we can work towards. But again, heroic individuals will only get so far in their efforts. So what kind of scaffolding, what kind of support can we offer to say more than just, you should do this, to this is how we can do it, this is how we can work together to try to move closer to our goals. One of the deliverables as well is to get people together face-to-face for meetings. So, it's great to have open repositories, which comes once a year somewhere on the globe, but it is really important, I think, that we try to create venues for our folks working in this area to try to come together within a national space. One of the other areas we want to take a look at is standards for IR usage data. So of course this is incredibly important for a whole variety of reasons, which everyone in the room will know. What we want to do is we want to do some environmental scanning and understand what's happening. So we want to take a look at, we're here at Montana State University, so we want to take a look at things like RAMP, of course, IRIS UK, other metrics work that's happening, and try to again identify good ideas that are out there, and then talk about how we can implement those in a local fashion. So that's one of the deliverables for this goal, is to really do that surveying and try to present what some of the best options might be, working in concert with the community of folks who are out there running repositories. One area that we're really excited about is that we will be a guinea pig, a pilot implementer for the Open Air Advanced collaboration coming out of Europe. So there's people in the room that have far more expertise about open air than I do, but essentially with the aggregation work that's happening in Europe right now, they're now looking to, through Open Air Advanced, looking to identify international partners. And so Canada has put up its hand and said, yeah, this would be really useful for us. So that's something that we're looking at right now, is the metadata schemas, which are just in draft form, I think, getting finalized, looking at ways that we can implement the standards that are required for open air to allow us to do a better job of aggregating metadata coming out of our repositories with potentially full text information as well. One of the things that we're really excited about is in Canada, we've got 3 major funding agencies who essentially fund the bulk of the research. They're loosely grouped around health, science, technology, engineering, and social sciences and humanities research. And so we've managed to attract their attention, I think, and they're really interested in how they can sort of round trip the grant process to be able to tie that into actual OA publications and research data management. Planning and tracking, and have access to a dashboard that will essentially give them more information than they have right now about how their grant money is being spent. So we're really excited about that and looking forward to what can happen. I mentioned briefly already the Next Generation Repositories report that CORE put together, and if you stick around in this room, I think at 2:30, you can hear a lot more about it, so that's the plug for the session. You guys can pay me later. So, you know, if you've read the NGR report, I think there's an awful lot of information in there, a lot of really, really good things that the community should work towards. I think it'll be really helpful too in terms of demonstrating the value to researchers and funding agencies for what repository infrastructure can help support. But how do you get there? That's the tricky thing. So one of the things that the task group wants to do is take a look at the nuts and bolts of repository systems and standards and those sorts of things, and try to help people actually come up with plans to implement some of those recommendations. So all of this, of course, is not happening in isolation from other activities. So just to put in a token reference, at least, to some of the other clusters of activity that are happening related to the repository space. In Canada, we've got an initiative called Portage, which is led by the Canadian Association of Research Libraries. It's really to come up with a national plan for how research data can be supported. It doesn't claim to be the be-all and end-all of research data management support, but it's part of the infrastructure and scaffolding, again, that can help support research that needs to happen in today's day and age. So there's an awful lot there that deals with repositories and description, access, discovery, and of course long-term preservation that feeds back into the discussions that we're having amongst the ORWG. There's also some digital preservation working groups that are happening at the national level. There's a national heritage digitization strategy that is looking at content conversion and how that again feeds into digital asset management systems, repositories, how it's appropriately and persistently linked to. Lots of activity and discussion happening around opportunities to do national, we have a national site license for a lot of journal subscriptions. So we're looking at what's involved with setting up a national TDR, extending what is Scholars Portals, existing service for the Ontario, province of Alberta, universities, higher ed institutions. And then lots of discussion about open educational resources, which I think touch on all of the different content types that I've mentioned. So that is kind of a summary of where things are right now. We're hoping that in future meetings we'll be able to report back on some of the more concrete things that we've been able to achieve, but wanted to provide you with an update. So I don't know, Kathleen, if you had anything else to add. But otherwise, if there's time left over, we're happy to take questions or suggestions.
While you're sort of recovering from lunch and thinking about questions, I'll maybe ask a question quickly. You're sort of saying that one thing that you're really interested in is looking at how repositories can add value, and I think if I sort of understand the direction correctly, is effectively saying, aren't repositories a publication platform that could be as good or better than current publication platforms? Which I find really interesting. A question that you'll then run into is authors, academics, and the academic reward system. Do you also have some work planned to engage with academics and sort of take them along the journey?
We do. Kathleen might have more to say about this. I know that was a hot topic at the recent CORE meeting, was how do we engage directly with researchers to make sure that they understand the value that, to make sure that we are delivering to them the value that they would expect of repository infrastructure. So we do want to take a look at what the options might be for, being able to add in value-added services like, for example, peer review, which has come up in some of the discussions this morning, I know already. Things like overlay journals are another opportunity, I think, to build on top of existing institutional repository infrastructures. But Kathleen, do you have?
Well, I would just add that I think that's the direction that we need to go. And the question is how we move from where we are now to there. And I think part of that is building on those peer review services. But when I engage with researchers, that's almost too radical for them. They're still so connected with the idea of the journal and the journal title and how the journal represents their community. So I think we need to work on incremental projects that aren't all the way with peer review on top and an assessment system on top, but take us slowly in that direction. And so for one example is that we've just launched, I say the collective we, but it was an overlay journal with a Cambridge mathematics professor, Timothy Gowers, not on top of our repository content, but on top of archive. And we're using that as a model of something that we're looking to see whether we could start trying to do that kind of thing collectively on top of repositories. So I imagine in the Canadian situation, we could try a pilot project with Canadian-specific content, for example, like Canadian Studies or Journal of Aboriginal Studies on top of repositories. I think it's kind of a bit of an incremental step-by-step process to move in that direction where we start to show that we can really provide value to the research community. If that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you. We have another question.
Hello. Hi, Kathleen. You mentioned that you've moved to you're trying to move away from institutional-based repositories towards a more national approach in Canada, which obviously is seen as a positive step, or you wouldn't be going that way. What do you think are the main challenges to making that kind of move, and how do you overcome them nationally? Because often institutions like their repositories; they like having them in-house. Tough question, but yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if I have a great answer for you, but I agree with you completely. It's a very tough question. The Canadian Association of Research Libraries several years ago came up with something called an adoptive repository strategy. So acknowledging that some institutions are going to have greater resources than others and the wherewithal to be able to manage repositories over a longer period of time. The idea was that let's see if we can leverage those existing repositories and open them up to repositories that maybe don't want to take on that burden or don't even have the ability to do so, even if they wanted to. But one of the things I think that's happened with that adoptive repository strategy is that, it was a good idea, but it hasn't had, I don't think, the uptake that we would have hoped. And I'm looking at Kathleen here to see if she's got examples of where that adoptive repository has been picked up on. I know at University of Alberta, we've had some discussions with some of the smaller local universities, and I think we will be able to make something happen there, but it's very slow by the time you work out the politics and the legalities, and if there's funding involved, then forget it, it's going to be a long ways away. So it just takes a long time to work out those sorts of discussions, but kind of where we're at right now, I think there is a lot of institutional investment already made in repositories, and so it makes it very difficult then to get people to really open up their minds and think about whether we need as many repositories as we do and what would they look like. Could they be reshaped differently from institution to thematic, subject, disciplinary? Could you take a country like Canada and start to coordinate that in some fashion regionally or otherwise? I think, as we move along, we're all learning as we go, and I think there is a maturation of services that will naturally begin to happen, but I would argue that we're at the very beginning of that journey, not the end.
Yeah, we kind of, we're also having that discussion with our National Research Data Project. So I think because it's just starting now and we don't have a lot of data repositories, the conversation around should we all really have a data repository is more relevant for that kind of data type. But I think if we can develop some collaborative agreements around the data repositories, we might be able to model our institutional repositories more around those new models. One example in the international community is Japan, and so they have there's over 700 universities in Japan, and most of them have repositories, institutional repositories, but they've started a cloud hosting service for the repositories, and I think there's something like 500 institutional repositories that are now managed in the cloud, basically by a centralized service. So not every university has to do all of the technology upgrading and so on behind that. So I think it could be a possible model also to transition Canada towards more of a collective approach.
The research data space has been really refreshing because we kind of had a chance to do a bit of a do-over. So take what we had learned from some of the repository, the more traditional institutional repository work and digitization and things like that, and do things a bit differently. So I think, you know, I briefly referenced the portage model, which Kathleen talked about, but that's a good example, I think, of being able to bring together expertise from across the country and more strategically set up clusters of support for different areas of research data management support, preservation, stewardship.
Just as a quick plug, I'll be giving a talk tomorrow about shared repository services and moving to more sort of centralized, or maybe not, platforms. But
Hi, my name is Stuart Tucker. I work at the World Bank, which is a very different organization than libraries. So my perspective is perhaps quite a minority one. However, even within the networks that you're talking about, I think you still have to overcome sort of the different institutional goals that people have. We actually tried to make an initiative of pushing for a common platform for international organizations that had very similar content, you know, or audiences really, and found all sorts of issues there. Perhaps the only viable solution going forward might have been a unified search platform that went to the various repositories that would still have their own facing. But who's going to pay for the money for that? That's a big issue. But I think the issue of challenging the commercial journal business model is a huge one right now, and one that's not easily cast aside because it's not just the commerce behind it, it's the prestige of tenure processes. Journal impact factors matter. What journal you publish matters tremendously. So don't go in, you know, sort of rosy-eyed and say, we can sweep this all away. Each profession is gonna put their feet up in defending the journals they like.
So just to acknowledge that we completely understand and agree with your point about how connected researchers are to their journal titles and the aspect of prestige. And I think that's why we're trying to work, again, like incremental steps rather than saying we're going to be able to switch the whole system. So for example, the journal that we're working on with, that's hosted on Scholastica, and all of the costs are being covered by Queen's University, is what they're doing is setting up a journal that is going, in their eyes, the aim is to have a high quality, very prestigious math journal that is open access and built basically essentially on archive. So I think, again, we need to be pragmatic and realistic about our strategy for trying to change the system, that there's a lot of social aspects and other aspects involved as well. So I completely agree with you.
okay, thank you. Can we thank the speakers again for their talk? And we'll now hear if instead of pragmatic approaches, we have something more revolutionary from Ireland.
Hello, can you hear me? I'm short, so I have to bring the microphone down again. Okay, so my name's Catherine Cassidy. And is that meant to do that? Better? Okay. So I'm working for the Digital Repository of Ireland, which is a national infrastructure, a trusted digital repository aimed at the humanities and social science communities within Ireland. Here's our repository. You can find it at dri.ie, and it's, as I said, it's a national infrastructure. We have member organisations across Ireland who deposit their own materials into the repository, and they keep control and ownership of their materials, so we're not kind of taking them off them. We also have, as well as this kind of front end that we provide for access, we provide a preservation service. We have kind of we are trying to be a trusted digital repository, so we're providing long-term trusted access to these resources and preservation services. And we also have an API whereby we allow people to kind of build services on top of our repository so that they can provide a different front end for access. So the preservation layer is handled by us, but we provide like a basic search front end and discovery interface, but you can also build your own discovery interface. Or if you want, this is one we developed ourselves for a particular project within Ireland, but we also have a few third parties now trying to use the API to produce maybe mobile apps and things like that basically connect to our service and pull out resources and display them in whatever way they want to display them, which might be quite different to how we display them, which is in the context of we're putting them with all the other resources that we've got from other organizations as well. So that's the introduction to who we are and what we do. But the title of this talk, or what we proposed, was the Digital Repository of Ireland, a case study, or I wouldn't start from here. And I think the tagline might be a little bit unfair, because it's not that where we are now is in any way bad. We have a stable production service that's serving the digital humanities and social sciences community within Ireland. We have member organisations from across Ireland who are all depositing materials in there. And we also have several hundred views every day. So we have users using those materials, and people are accessing them and finding these resources that maybe weren't available online before, or if they were much harder to find. So I believe we're adding a lot of value for these communities, and I think we're quite successful. But what we wanted to do was, bearing in mind the conference theme this year of sustaining open, we wanted to talk a little bit about, well, our experience as an open source project or an open source organization producing the software and the system, and to look at kind of what we did well or what went well, and then also maybe more usefully to take a critical look at what didn't go so well, the things that we maybe did that we could have done better, or the things where the landscape shifted around us or things changed, and the problems that those things caused. And I think that's, hopefully for us, that'll be a useful exercise. And we've just going through the process of writing the slides and discussing this, I think we have come up with a few things where we're like, oh yeah, we should have done that slightly differently. But I hope maybe it'll be useful for some other people who might be at an earlier stage in this journey, looking at some of the things, the pitfalls that we came across, and maybe you can avoid those. So hopefully it'll be interesting to somebody. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit, first of all, about the project and kind of the background of how the project developed. And then I'm going to go on to talk specifically about some of the things that went well and some of the things that maybe could have gone better. So the project itself, it started 2011, and it was a funded project originally for 5 years. And we had sort of at the beginning a requirements gathering phase and a policy development phase before we started doing any actual development. So one of the first things the project did was to do a survey of the Irish humanities and social sciences landscape, and look at the organizations who were producing data in these fields and what they were doing with their data. So who had repositories in place or archives? What kind of standards and things were they using? How were they organizing their data? And looking at the digitization, but also specifically about the archiving and preservation that was currently out there within our kind of designated community. So if you see on the left-hand side there, the green publication, it's up on our website if anyone's interested to see more at dri.ie/policy publications, I think. And that's a report that we did based on this survey of the current practice within Ireland. And that was released in 2012, I think that was published. And it's called Digital Archiving in Ireland, National Survey of the Humanities and Social Sciences. So that informed a lot of the requirements and the things that we decided we needed to do in order to provide a national service that would be useful to these organizations who we surveyed for this report. We also then looked at international approaches. So the center document there is a report called Caring for Digital Content, Mapping International Approaches. And that looked at a lot of like certainly at other national repositories and national archives and generally the national infrastructures that were out there, but also other institutional initiatives that were happening in other countries aside from Ireland. So we looked at a few of the larger projects that were out there, and including also some smaller ones, and tried to figure out how they were approaching the problem of producing kind of these services and this long-term preservation, specifically looking at a lot of the social sciences and humanities area, but also looking at a little bit beyond that. We also produced then, kind of based on the findings of these surveys and these literature reviews and so on that we did, we produced a set of requirements. And that was produced, we had a requirements manager who was doing a requirements analysis at the beginning of the project, and she put together a set of requirements of what we need to deliver in order to provide a useful national repository service for our users. And that's the less pretty looking diagram or document on the right there. So that one has kind of, it's a standard requirements document, but it goes through, it's a lot of those requirements are coming from the lessons we learned by looking at what current practice was in Ireland and in the rest of the world, and then kind of gathering those into a set of requirements. So some of the requirements we came up with are a little bit maybe unusual, and not other people were doing them. Not many other people were doing those. So I'm not trying to say like we're special and we had like really unique requirements, so you know we couldn't use other things that other people had done. Of course, everyone's project has its own unique requirements, but I'm going to highlight a few of the ones that maybe were a little bit unusual. So one of the things we found, and you'll find this diagram in that green document there, the Digital Archiving in Ireland report, we found that a lot of organizations within the humanities and digital and social sciences areas already had some metadata standards. They were already using metadata to describe their collections. They had some sort of system where they were cataloging things. Maybe they had some sort of an archive or repository there already. And we had a look we asked them like which metadata standards were they using. And we found that this was kind of the spread. So Dublin Core was by and far the most popular. Then EAD, MODS, and Mark 21 were all relatively popular as well. And then a bunch of other ones with less popularity. So what we decided to do, and we made this into a requirement of our repository, was that we would support the top 4 most popular metadata standards that were out there. So that meant we were going to be able to, we wanted to, if you already are using some sort of cataloging system, you can just export your metadata into XML. You can then come to our system and slurp that all in, and then suddenly you'll, with very little work on your part, you should be able to get your data into the repository. So that was the idea, and that meant we had to support more than one metadata format, which was a little bit unusual. We also decided that since we were ingesting this XML that people were exporting from their existing system, that we should kind of store that and be able to give it back to you in exactly the same format. So we didn't want to kind of pull it all into a database and lose the original XML, but we wanted to be able to basically keep that XML there. Even if they went in and edited the digital object or the descriptive metadata, they could make changes to the content of the metadata, but they'd be able to get the same file out with those changes applied. We obviously, this is not particularly unique. Most people have a variety of media in their repositories, but we had audiovisual materials, a lot of images, mostly images, quite a lot of textual material. So that's the kind of stuff that we knew we were going to have to deal with based on the discussions we'd had with our designated community. And that's gradually expanding now. We have some XML data that's coming in as well, and some other formats. We also have a lot of Irish language materials, and we have a requirement to be a bilingual repository. So that means that's like more than one thing goes into that. So first of all, we need to support Irish language assets or digital like binaries. So if you have a PDF that's in the Irish language, we need to be able to support that. And that's reasonably straightforward usually, but you do need to make sure that we have appropriate tags and fields that you can specify the language of the resource. So that's straightforward enough. We also wanted to provide a translated bilingual repository interface. So we have, you can toggle between English language or Irish language on the repository interface, and then all the kind of messages and menu items and so on are all translated. But then the more unusual thing that we decided to do was to support Irish language metadata, so Irish language descriptive metadata. So if you are cataloging in the Irish language, you can then import that into the repository as well. And if you give us the XML file and put the XML lang attribute in there and specify whether it's English or Irish, then the repository will actually import that, index it differently depending on whether it's English or Irish, and then it'll display it differently. So here, I don't think you can see it very well, but there's a little toggle thing underneath. The top paragraph there is the English language description, I think, and the bottom one is the Irish language description, and you can toggle each of those on or off. So you can say, well, I only want to see the Irish language metadata, or I only want to see the English language metadata. So that's quite an interesting feature, I think. A little bit unusual. Okay. We also made, I suppose, like a religious decision that we were committed to openness. So we had a commitment to open access, and all of our metadata is open. It's CC0 for metadata. We also encourage people to apply not terribly restrictive licenses to the binaries and the assets that they ingest. We are committed to open access wherever possible. So sometimes we do understand that somebody might need an embargo on some material, but they do have to make their metadata open, even if their binary is a little bit more closed or has a more restrictive license. Open data in general, open source, and so on. We also, from the very beginning of the project, had decided we were going to be a trusted digital repository because we wanted to be a national resource. We wanted people to use us. We wanted to follow the best practice in providing long-term digital preservation, and becoming a kind of a certified trusted digital repository seemed the way to go for that. Of course, to become a fully certified trusted digital repository is quite a difficult process. So what we did first was we went through the process of getting the data seal of approval, and we got that, and then subsequently that's become Core Trust Seal, and we reapplied for a Core Trust Seal this year or just at the end of last year, and we've got that now as well. So then we're kind of hoping to go forward and at least do a self-audit based on track, and then see where we go from there in terms of getting actual full certification. So, and again, that brings in a lot of new requirements specific to being a trusted digital repository. And if you go through the process, or if you follow kind of the track checklist and go through that when you're creating your requirements or building your repository, you'll find that imposes quite a lot of requirements upon you that you might not otherwise have thought of. So, because we had all these various requirements, we found that there was nothing out there that we could take just as an off-the-shelf sort of a solution. So what we decided to do was build a bespoke solution based on open source tools and components. And these are some of the main tools that we're using, or components that we're using. Veera, Fedora, Solar, and then we use Ceph for storage. So, and several other ones as well, but these are kind of the main ones that we're more involved with. And these, again, these are fantastic tools, and when I'm going to go on now to talk about what went well and maybe what some of the things that didn't go well. And one of the things that absolutely went well was the choice to use these open source tools. So what went well? Yay. So there's a lot of things that went well, and the first thing I'm going to say is like us joining the Veera and Fedora consortium or consortia or whatever they call themselves was a very good decision, and using those tools has allowed us to very quickly put together a system that otherwise, if we'd been working from scratch, it'd be very difficult to do. It allowed us to develop things quite quickly and put together kind of a prototype very early on that we were able to get our members to start ingesting into. So they're really good tools. And any of the open source tools, if anybody is at the beginning of their journey and wondering how to start to develop a repository, go and look at some of these open source tools. We also open sourced our own code base, and that allowed us to get a certain amount of kind of use of that code base and feedback on stuff that we'd written, which was very useful. So we had one of our member organizations, Maynooth University, based in Ireland, and their library used our code base to produce their own, or to set up their own, like their special collections repository. So they were putting their materials in there as well, and then they were also ingesting materials into our repository, but they were using our code base, and they were giving us feedback and suggestions and some code contributions, and just generally discussing things with us, like saying, oh, but we wanted it to do this, why does it work this way? And we were able to kind of get some feedback on that, which was very useful. And also, you get a lot of that same support and discussion by being involved in the Samvera and Fedora communities. We had I'm going to say mostly agile development process, because some purists might say, well, you didn't do this or you didn't do that. But we did actually have quite a lot of rapid prototyping and feedback from real users. And that was our member institutions who were ingesting materials into the repository from very early on. Even though our actual public launch was a little bit later, we wanted to have a lot of, or at least a decent amount of content in there before we made a big public launch. And keeping up with community developments, I've put it as a good thing, but actually later on I'm going to say we didn't do everything well with that. But we did do some things, like a successful migration from Fedora 3 to Fedora 4. And we have all those reports and things that we published, so we've been quite open and transparent about the development process. So what's not gone so well? I don't have too many slides. I think I'll fit it in just about, because we're getting a bit tight on time. So, resourcing. I'm not going to say too much about this, but I will say that if you're interested in hearing about our downsizing, there's a talk on Thursday morning where my colleagues, Natalie Harrower and Dermot Frost, who are in the audience over there, will be telling the story of our downsizing. So we went from a kind of a large publicly funded project with a lot of staff and maybe 10 or 11 development staff to having 2 developers. So we can't say anymore, you know what, we're going to put 2 developers for 2 months on refactoring our whole code base to use Valkyrie or something, to take an example that's being talked about a lot at the moment. We don't really have the resources to do that anymore. So we're a little bit, it makes it harder. We were able to do that before, and now we can't. That's probably all I wanted to say about that. The other thing is, I said we're using Fedora, but from the beginning, for both performance reasons and kind of for reasons related to the fact that we wanted to be a TDR, and we wanted to have control over the way that the materials were stored on disk and so on, and be able to have that documented and have control over that without some changes being introduced by a third-party tool. We decided to keep our binaries outside of Fedora. And then later on, we started using a thing called Moab, which is it's a little bit like Bagot, which you might be familiar with, but it's versioned, and that comes out of Stanford. And they have a Ruby gem that you can use to produce these kind of, to store on disk your files in a particular format that includes checksumming and all of that kind of stuff. So because we're now doing that, then we also copied all our data streams, our metadata data streams, out of Fedora and stored them on disk. So now we're not using a lot of the Fedora functionality. So we're using Fedora, you have to have it installed, but we're not using so much of it. So that's maybe not the best way to have done that, or maybe we need to make different technology decisions or something, but that's where we are anyway. Then in terms of Samvera, we did not follow all of you into the wonderful world of RDF. So because we wanted to be able to ingest that XML and give it back to the user, we're still using XML data streams, and everybody else has moved on and has left us behind. So now we're using something that's a little bit out of step from a lot of the rest of the community, and it means it's difficult for us to update to some of the new tools and new libraries that are coming out, because they all are kind of assuming you're using RDF. So that and some other decisions, like we decided to refactor our data models early on to use Sophia, and then that kind of went out of fashion, I'll say, because things are moving along and things keep changing, and sometimes we manage to get left behind, and that was okay when you had 10 developers, but it's not as easy to fix that when you have 2 developers. And we didn't commit back to the community as much as we should have. It took us a little while to get things set up so that we were actually proper members and we could submit code, but we kind of let our code drift a little bit from the community's code base, and that makes it a little bit difficult again now that we're under-resourced or relatively less resourced. So lessons learned: submit your changes back to the community. I'm out of time, I think. So, 2 minutes. Oh, we're fine then. Okay, so submit your changes back to the community. I'd say that's the most important thing. We still have a couple of repositories of stuff that we forked and we made a few changes to, but maybe we haven't actually submitted back. So there's things like that where we really should have done it. And then there's more complicated situations where just our code has diverged quite a bit because we had slightly different requirements, or because we stayed with XML or something like that instead of moving to RDF. But do try to, whenever possible, submit everything back to the community, and then you're just using community-supported code instead of having your own version of the code. And the second thing, kind of takeaway, is that churn is inevitable, so do give yourself time and resources and schedule in the work that you're going to have to do to update your open source libraries and tools that you're using. So don't always assume that you have to, in every sprint or in every development kind of time piece, you're going to be working on new functionality or something like that. You also need to leave time for going looking at what's happening in the community, and then maybe upgrading some of your stuff and refactoring your code to use new things that are coming out of the community. And keep track of emerging consensus or standards, but don't adopt too early at the same time. So I think we probably made a mistake by moving to the Sophia models for our data model, because then things move towards PCDM and different directions, and we're sort of left with a code base based on an oldish thing that maybe some people are still using, but it's gone out of fashion anyway. And then revisit your assumptions, because I know we had it as one of our core requirements was that we ingest in XML and we give them back that same XML, but yeah, I don't know, do our users actually want that? We never revisited that to say, well, maybe, and that's just one example, but do revisit your assumptions and see if what you're doing now still matches what the community want. It turns out a lot of our users aren't giving us XML files anyway. They have all their metadata in Excel spreadsheets, and they're trying to export it out into a format that matches ours. So maybe we could look at different ways of ingesting, not just taking their XML, and maybe that would help us to open up the way to move towards RDF or other things that are happening within the community. So, and that's it. So thank you very much, dri.ie, and we're on the Twitters, and that's me on the bottom on Twitter if you want to talk to me. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Any questions from the audience?
Thank you for the presentation. It was very interesting. I think I'm just going to reiterate the question from the previous talk about institutions and organizations being invested and liking their own repositories. So you mentioned that you did an environmental scan of what's out there in Ireland. How did you get them on board with getting their content into your repository, and was there any pushback from those who wanted to actually keep their content to themselves? Thank you.
Yes, there was. There are people who don't really see the value of putting something into a national repository, but there's a few things that we can offer that are harder for them to offer themselves. Well, for example, the preservation aspect of it. So we are a trusted digital repository. We have the Core Trust seal. We're somewhat certified in that area, whereas most of the organizations out there. So we're dealing with a lot of not the same kind of institutional repositories within universities or research institutes, but a lot of memory organizations, museums, and things like that, who are getting getting funding for digitization, because everybody wants to digitize their collections. And they're getting funding for that, but then they've no game plan for after the funding ends and they've digitized a load of stuff. So those people are actually quite willing to, like they're hosting a website and they've put them all up on a website, but then when you talk to them about long-term preservation, then they actually realize that what they have is it's not going to give them long-term preservation, and then they start looking around for well, where can I go to get that service. We've also found that, and I don't know, you might be talking a little bit about the membership model on Thursday. Yeah, so we have a membership model which offers a lot of benefits aside from just being able to give your data to us. So there's a lot of training, there's a lot of events where people get to come together and share experience and things like that. So there's a whole value proposition or something outside of just putting the data into a repository, and I think that helps. And just generally I think with a lot of the publications and stuff that we've done, I think we've kind of positioned ourselves as people who do know a little bit about this stuff, and people are coming to us and asking us, well, what should I do? And some people do already have their own repositories and they're going to stick with them, but they might also put stuff into our repository because they get the benefit of it being cross-searchable with other organizations' materials and being displayed in a wider context. But I think we found that a lot of the smaller organizations in Ireland who have a load of digitized materials are actually delighted to see that there's somewhere they can put them and get that preservation service.
I'd like to ask you a slightly different question. And first I would say, yeah, if you can't contribute right now, we've been in that place before, and that's one of the beauties of those communities. But I wonder, because you're requiring open access, you know, let's just say, for instance, if Ireland wanted to protect its data by putting it in Canada, and Canada wanted to protect its data by putting it in Ireland, does both of those countries having an open access policy and requiring that make that easier?
I don't actually know. And
Do
there is
have a desire to have geographic diversity preservation?
I mean, we have 2 sites, but within Ireland and not that far away. If a big enough meteorite comes in, I guess both of our sites are gone. Yeah. So I think, and we do have some. Like, we wrote some pieces so that you could put things in the cloud in future as well. So some of the storage could go to the cloud, but absolutely, you know, the idea of national repositories and national infrastructures working together to do that sort of thing, to share their resources, is a great idea.
Yeah, it's just with our networks. You know, we've talked about it for a long time, needing some protection, and it's a hard problem that we haven't gotten worked out, and people always talk about the intellectual property rights and other things that block them, and it sounds impossible, but I would like to get there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, of course, in Europe now there's a lot of talk about this GDPR thing and privacy and so on, but a lot of the kind of materials that we have, they're not mostly personal data. So it's not, you know, if you have a scan of some 1,000-year-old document, that's not going to contain any personal data. So it's not always a problem, but some people get hung up on the legalities of sharing data across borders and things, but sometimes it's not as big an issue as people think.
Okay, I think we have to move on to the next paper, but before we do that, can we all thank Catherine again for her talk? And are we going to hear about next generation repositories?
So while we get started, good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, it's working. It's a pleasure to be here and to present the work that we have been doing around the next generation repositories. Last year in Brisbane in the Open Repository Conference, we also had a panel session. We were still on on the process of developing our recommendations. And this year, it's good to be back here to open repositories and to have some further developments and some further work to present. This presentation, the paper was authored by most of the contributors to the Next Generation Repository group, and this presentation will be done by me, that I will be this very short introduction, and then I will hand it over to Peter, that will do the second part of the presentation, and then Andrea. Peter is from Open University, but he will present itself. By the way, I'm Eloy Rodrigues. I'm from Min University, but I have the privilege of being the chair of the Confederation of Open Access Repository, and I also have chaired this working group. Peter is from Open University, and Andrea Bolin is from For Science. And again, I will come back at the end for just give you an overview of what is going on and some future developments. I will just, in a minute, want to give some context of all this work. We have been hearing on different, from different perspectives and focusing on different aspects, the limitations and the problems that exist with the current scholarly communication system. And I think overall, I think it's not, we don't need to be very bold to say that the current system is really broken, because it is not sustainable, and we know that there is this completely madness of increasing costs of subscriptions, but now also increasing costs of APCs. And also because of that is not equitable. Large parts of the world and some disciplinary areas that don't have the financial resources are risking to be marginalized from the intellectual and the scientific dialogue, and it's not innovative. If we look at the current journals, and especially the journals from the commercial publishers, and we look back on the last 50 years, of course they all become digital, but I think they don't have a very good record on innovation. And this is something, so the problems of the current scholarly communication system is something that we want to address and we think that we can address that, and part of it, and especially also the technological part of it and part of the social aspects. And on the first presentation on this session, I think it was very important to mention that the technological part of it is just one of the dimensions that we need to fix, and it is much more important to change the behaviors. Oops, I lost it. Okay, I'm back. Oh, it's back, yeah, okay. So we believe that building on the current existing network of repositories that are sustainable and sustained by research institutions that are around for a long time, that can be at least part of the solution. But we have a problem, and the problem is that the current repositories and the technologies that we are using are old, and they do not provide us with the functionalities that we have. So in 2016, CORE, the Confederation of Open Access Repositories, has established this as one of its priorities, and we created a group, this group of working group of next generation repositories with around 20 people from around the world. It is really a very diverse group from different perspectives, both regionally, different software platforms, different experiences. And the aim of this group was to identify the functionalities and the architectures that we need to develop this new type of ecosystem and infrastructure that can make our vision come true. So, and with this, I pass to Peter.
So, thank you very much, Eloy, for the introduction. So the aim of the next generation repositories is to help us to overcome the challenges that still make it difficult to move beyond repositories as document silos. The group wants to see a globally interoperable network of repositories and global services built on top of repositories fulfilling the expectations of users in the 21st century. So during this talk, we will address several use cases, behaviors, and technologies this working group aims to enable in the next generation repositories. This diagram kind of shows what we can do with repositories today. Repositories they are up to an extent interoperable, and the interoperability which we see today is kind of synonymous with one protocol called OAI-PMH, which enables us to basically harvest all the metadata describing the resources stored in the repository. And this is really useful because we can develop certain or a range of services using the data which can be aggregated from many different repositories. And it's also not surprising because interoperability is and has always been at the core of the institutional repositories mission since 2002, or basically since the time repositories have been created. So some people can be asking whether repositories today are kind of in crisis, because there have been certain voices which were basically saying that, you know, Richard Pointer's interview with Clifford Lynch, for example, last year mentioned that OAI-PMH has failed. Eric van der Velde goes even further and says basically that institutional repositories are kind of a failure completely. And while I kind of disagree with some of their argumentation, it is true that when you look more closely into their arguments, what it seems to boil down is a criticism of a lack of interoperability across repositories. So even though we have some notion of interoperability, they kind of feel that it is not sufficient. And I think this is something with which all of us agree. So one of the kind of ironic points here is that actually the publishers who have been having a lot of more resources basically in this space, there is no comparison with the publishing platforms with regards to interoperability, because their platforms are far less interoperable than the repositories of today. So just bear that in mind, I think, because it's interesting. So as I said, lack of interoperability is a major barrier to innovation, and that leads me to one of the kind of key ideas or approaches of the next generation repositories group, which kind of says that we should make the resource rather than the repository the focus of services and infrastructure. People, when they interact and they do all sorts of things within the scholarly communication system, what they actually care about are the resources. And by resources, we don't necessarily mean just the research outputs. We mean also, the resources could be research data, comments, all sorts of things which exist. So when we started the work on the next generation repositories, we wanted to understand what users really want, and we kind of had a consultation to establish what should be the expectations for the next generation repositories. And the output of this has been basically a set of user stories, which we published in a document in February 2007. And when you look a little bit closer on these stories, you can kind of see that they cluster along certain themes. So what we have one theme which is related to discovery and exposing resources. We have another theme which is related to research workflows and the research life cycle. And we have a third theme which is related to research evaluation. And then we have certain sub-themes which you can see as part of this. And when we talked to people about, we kind of showed these user stories to them, some people kind of were a little bit skeptical, and they said, these stories are not particularly innovative. But actually what we realized then was basically that the stories, even though some people might not consider them innovative, when they read them, they realized that they haven't been fulfilled, they haven't been implemented. And so what we had to do is we had to try to understand what needs to be enabled in the repositories so that these use cases could be fulfilled and implemented. So in this diagram, I'm kind of showing you what we envisage in terms of the new in terms of the next generation repositories. What we really want to see is a significant expansion of the interoperable capabilities of repositories. We want to see an expansion we want to see the repositories being able to be interoperable at the level of content, not just metadata. Be able to basically capture all sorts of activities, such as notifications, such as interactions of users with the repositories. We want to see users being recognized across the repositories network. So I don't want to have a login in 20 different repositories. I want to, when I go to a particular repositories, I want to be recognized. And we want repositories to support kind of additional resources which are related to the research papers, such as comments, peer reviews, and various kinds of messages. So repositories should kind of become almost like a social platform for doing research. And when we kind of created this vision, we tried to understand what kind of technologies might be needed to support that vision. So we created a document in November, basically last November, end of last November, where we list a set of technologies or behaviors, how we call them, which are needed to be enabled in the repositories. And these technologies, these behaviors, then need to be supported by very concrete technologies. And this is the list of the technologies which we talked about or which we talk about in the document. And one of the things I want to mention here is that we also realized that in certain areas we had technologies which were kind of readily available and which could be adopted fairly quickly by the repositories community to enable and make certain use cases which we thought about kind of plausible to implement. But there were also situations where we really identified gaps, which we really invite the community to address these gaps, because we, for example, do not have the protocols for solving those particular issues. So in this presentation, in the rest of this presentation, we're going to show you just some of those. We're going to talk about notification protocols, resourcing, and signposting. But please feel free to download the document and read a lot more about this. And by doing so, we're going to address only a small fraction of the use cases I mentioned. So we are going to address more specifically this fraction, which is about badge, navigation, and notification services. And that is particularly important for use cases related to text and data mining, and for example, discovering metadata that describe a particular scholarly resource. So we have 3 discovery mechanisms in next generation repositories. Badge discovery is something which everyone is kind of already aware of. This is very similar to OAI PMH. Someone, a robot, an agent, must be able to go to a repository and download all its content. But here we are not talking, as I said before, only about metadata as we are talking in OAI PMH, but we are talking about all sorts of the resources which are stored within the repositories. Then we have another completely new discovery mechanism which we talk about, which is called navigation. And navigation is about helping robots to find resources in repositories by means of navigation. What it means is that a robot, an agent, should be able to go to a repository and not download everything from it, but basically choose what they want to interact with. And that should make it much simpler for software to actually reuse from the repository only what they need, and it should also make it more efficient. And the last area are services, is a discovery mechanism which we call notification, and that is based on the idea that repositories need to be active. It must be possible to subscribe to repositories or to something which we will call hubs later, to receive certain changes proactively. And that should result in a situation where the scholarly communication system or the repository system is much more kind of reactive. It enables you to see changes very fast, which is at the moment not the case. So here I would like to hand over to Andrea, who will tell you about the batch and navigation technologies, and then I will talk about the notification ones.
Yeah. Thanks, Pedro, for the introduction. So I'm Andrea Bolini from For Science. I'm the head of technology. So I'm deeply involved with several of open source community. I want to provide you some update on what has been done, especially into the space community. And I want to focus on signposting and resource sync. Other than for a matter of time, it's also nice to see why these two technologies are so important. So what you see here is a visualization of the relation between behavior and technologies. So in pink, you have the technology, and the size of the ball is related to the number of behavior that are enabled by this technology. So what is evident is that signposting and resource sync are the two primary technologies that we want to address, that we want to have a wide adoption, because they enable us to start to talk to address several behaviors that we have identified in our report. So concretely, what is signposting? Signposting is something very, very simple. This is the key word to understand signposting. Signposting is simple, is efficient, is effective, is the basic approach of the World Wide Web. So when you go on a web page, you start to navigate from one page to another following a link. And you are able to do that because you see the HTML document rendered in your browser, you recognize a link, and you click on this link. Unfortunately, machines don't have a so easy life than you to navigate a link in HTML content. They need to be identified properly. And the best way to do that is use HTTP header. HTTP header is something that you don't see when you use the browser, but is the fast way to transmit structural information to another machine that is interacting with your service. So using links in HTTP and especially using typed link, so adding a simple semantic to this link to say, okay, this resource, this web page is related to another page that describes an author. So this article is authored by a person that have an orchid. Or this article that you see here as metadata, as a splash page, have a full text. And this is the link of the full text. So the nice thing is that signposting have a wide adoption right now. And I'm proud to say that as For Science, we have implemented the signposting in DSpace and also in Open Journal System. The implementation of Open Journal System was funded by OpenAIRE. So what you can do when you have signposting in place? When you have signposting, OpenAIRE, that is a content aggregator based especially mainly on OIPMH, just get the metadata from OJS system, from journal platform. And what they can do is sometime in this metadata, they get an URL. And they just make a guess that this URL will take the user to some full text. But the user is on his own, he need to click this URL and he will find something. It could be the PDF file, or it could be another splash page where the user need to find the PDF file. The user is able to do that, but machine no. So the current limit of OpenAIRE is that it is not able to harvest the full text. So this stops OpenAIRE to make any advanced service on text mining. He cannot cache the content. He cannot provide advanced service on top of this content. Moreover, some of the information available here are hidden into metadata. So this journal article have a Creative Commons license that is not exposed on OIPMH. But this Creative Commons license can be easily exposed as a typed link in the HTTP header, so using the signpost technology. And this information can be collected by OpenAIRE and advanced service can be built on top of that. So firstly, the second technology is resource sync. It's just a bit more complicated than a sitemap, but not so much because first, what is this? It is the successor of the IPMH protocol. It extends to IPMH protocol in a way that enable also harvesting of content. So it's not only about metadata, but it's also about PDF file, images, content, your data set, and so on. It is faster, reliable, and scalable. I invite you to follow the session tomorrow after lunch in Ballroom C, where Peter will also present some result about a comparative analysis between IPMH and resource sync. It's allow real-time notification. So your repository will be able to say, hey, I have some new content that you could be interested in. And it is much more performant, to say. So why it is also not so complex? It is based on sitemap protocol. So it is the XML file that we already use to improve indexing in search engine. You have a lot of XML file here. Maybe this graphical representation is a bit more easy to understand. You have an entry point that describes the fact that you implement the resource sync protocol, and this endpoint is discoverable. So a machine can go to your repository, and without previous knowledge, you know that you implement the resource sync protocol, and you know which is the endpoint of your resource sync and which capability, which feature of resource sync you implement. So this is self-describing. And also it's incremental. So you have a change list, an XML, where the recent change in your resources are listed, and you can just take these as an increment. And it is much more efficient because you can provide the resource dump. So instead to allow the machine to go to download 1,000 small XML file of metadata, 1,000 PDF, you can just tell the other machine to download a zip file where all these content are packaged together. Okay, I will go back to Peterson, but I want to leave you with a message. So our next generation repository is much more. Is able to manage and provide access to a diversity of content. So we should stop to talk about PDF file. It's not republishing what is published on journal article. It's resource-centric, is a network repository. This is crucial. And if you look to also the recent news about GitHub, you know why it is so important to be distributed. And it's machine-friendly, so it needs to interact with other systems. And it's active. Peter will talk about what this means is active in machine-to-machine talking, but it's active also means that the content need to be accessed and used where it stays. So researchers expect from the repository to be able to interact with the resources that don't mean only to download the file. You need to access the information in the repository for computation, for elaboration, and things like that. Thank you.
So just very, very quickly, I'm going to talk about notification. I'm aware of the time, so it will be very fast. What we would like to see in next generation repositories is that repositories become extremely proactive, that it's possible to have third-party systems subscribing to various kinds of notifications that repositories should be capturing. And these notifications should not be only with regards to creation of content and other things. It should also correspond to activity content. I will show you on this diagram. So basically, at the moment, all we have in repositories are descriptive metadata about the content itself. But what we would like to capture in next generation repositories are information about people who created the content, people who interacted with the content, and people who perhaps created some overlay content about the content of others. This could be, for example, peer reviews about others, or it could be, telling the author that some people are reading and interested in their paper. How could this be realized? So we have a situation where we have lots of repositories, and we have also, so we would like to see that the repositories are interoperable and that they push notifications to certain areas which we call, or network services which we call hubs. There could be different hubs for different types of services, and the notifications from these hubs could be consumed by users or by robots, because if you think about it, robots are humans after all. And now I would like to invite Eloy to quickly finalize our presentation.
So just in 1 minute, just to say what we are currently doing and what we'll be doing in the next couple of months or year. So we have been working already on implementing these technologies on repository platforms. That there is work already going on, as Andrea already mentioned. For instance, the resource sync is being implemented in this space and OGS, and also, for instance, in Japan, on a collaboration between Japan and CERN, they are working on also implementing several of the technologies on the Invenue repository platform. And there is also other initiatives going, I think, also Kathleen and Jeff mentioned what is going on in Canada, and maybe on the questions we can also invite Kathleen to say something about what is going on here on the States. We had just 2 weeks ago a meeting of repository networks of around the world to discuss how can we develop the apps, some of these app services, and we hope to see some services emerging on the next on this second part of the year. And we have a group of people that will be still monitoring the new technology standards and protocols. And of course, we invite you all to contribute both to develop and implement these functionalities and technologies on your own platforms, and also join the discussion on the site of the Next Generation Repositories on GitHub. Thank you.
We have time for a quick question or two.
So if I understand correctly, all these new technologies, you want to have them within the repositories. Why are you doing that that way? It seems to me that it would be much more efficient and simpler to work at the level of aggregators, right? That's the aggregators that implement these technologies, and the repositories don't necessarily need to change much in their setup, right? They deliver the same metadata that includes the link to the full text, and it's up to the aggregators to figure out how to push that to the users, or do all the other things that you mentioned.
I also will invite then Andre and Peter to comment on this, but I think our vision is that you need to have these technologies and behaviors implemented both at the repository level and at the aggregator or the hub level, because as we envision it, probably some of these behaviors will be completely implemented through aggregators, but some of them may be implemented through direct dialogue between repositories individually, and not only through an aggregator service. So I think we need both things. So we need to implement this at repository level and at aggregator level, but I also invite Peter and Andrea.
Yeah, that's very much true, and it's an excellent question, because what we really want to see in next generation repositories is a much broader collaboration between the network services, global network services, and repositories. There are certain things which repositories do not allow at the moment. So one of the examples is aggregation of content. Aggregation of content is really difficult, and therefore for aggregators to push, for example, notifications to users is it's almost impossible, basically. So therefore we need certain little bits being enabled in the repositories so that the functionality can be, the global functionality can be realized and the users supported. But you're right, it can only be achieved through a collaboration of the global services and the repositories together.
Yeah, I would just to add an example. If you think about peer review, this is easy to build a global service, a centralized service where open peer review happen. You aggregate content from repository and you make in this layer open peer review. But the question is, the result of the open peer review is open scholarly communication also. And I need to have this content stored in a repository. I cannot accept to have this content only stored centrally, because if you store this in any central service, you can sell this service. You can lose access to this service. This is the fundamental importance of distributed control. And we need to have all the information in the repository. So it's go back to give information to the aggregator and get back information. It's not only push from repository to the aggregator.
Thank you. I think with that answer, we'll have to finish the session. So can we thank our speakers and indeed all speakers again?
For those of you who are interested in talking more about the next generation repositories, we're having an informal meeting tomorrow, 5:30 to 6:30. We'll meet at the Ballroom D. So it's just in between the end of the program and the gala dinner. Thanks.
And now it's time for break. Thank you.
David, can I use this black one? Hi, are you first? Okay, I guess we're supposed to look. What's your name?
Julie.
Hi, Julie. I'm Art.
Nice to meet you. This is Rebecca. She's co-presenting.
Hey, Rebecca.
Hi.
So you guys are from UNC. Do you work with John Crabtree?
No, who's John Crabtree?
He's in what is
Is
that?
he the Renzi thing?
He's not.
IROD stuff?
He's not. That's Reagan Moore and those guys. John's more in the. Oh, what's that other?
So.
Oh, I forget. Are you gonna? We're just all gonna use this, I guess.
That's what we were planning on doing. I just need to pull up a web browser.
Oh, want me to load this first, and then I'll let you go.
Sure. Gee, it sounds familiar. Yes.
Oh, I don't have my glasses. What do I do here? Just save it on the. David, help me out. I can't. I need some glasses. Can you see? I don't have my glasses with. I don't have my glasses with me. I just want to put this into a file.
You mean just drag it?
Mine file?
Yeah, that's fine.
Save it.
File. Save as, I guess.
Save? Is it there?
Yeah, it should be there somewhere now. Right? OR4, OR version 4 PDF. Yeah.
Hit it and then. Is this it? Maybe.
Maybe close that.
And the slideshow goes. Where's the slideshow?
Full screen. Oh, that's it.
That right here?
No, that says new page. That was it. That says read mode. It's called read mode, like full screen. How do I full screen?
Just close it. Just pull this out. God, I'm blind. I gotta go find my glasses. Right here?
No, this little green check mark. No, right next
Oh, no, that's.
right next to it.
Yeah, could you?
Or maybe you're right.
Just pull it out.
I don't know. It has a green check mark. I can't get it to come up. Oh, okay. There we go.
It's robust.
Is that yours?
Oh, yeah, thank you.
I wonder if I can turn this on. I was gonna download it just from here, so I didn't have to. I probably should download it.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, then that gets my stats up. So.
When you walked away, I was like, oh, one item. I just had to ask every time I walk in there, I had to ask them, like, oh, it's like a
I know. It usually drop. So you're done with events and stuff like that. It's a lot of work. I personally, it's a lot of work. They're all a lot of work.
Okay. I think we're good.
You know, like people, and then you got formal papers and stuff like that. Did you get any sponsors yet? It's not pulling up a web browser?
I'm trying to get to the documents folder, but I'm not a great PC user.
What is the documents?
I'm trying to get to the documents, or the downloads, sorry, the downloads. Because it downloaded to download. Yeah, I know.
How we become bad.
There is a PC up here. If there's a Adobe reader.
You think it went bad?
We don't have the bar on.
Mine's in
That's
PDF.
why I can't do it. Come on. It's okay. It's here. So let me save as and put it on the desktop, like you did. Where? Okay. All right, we're good.
You're on top. I'm
I
on
just
bottom.
need this to stay. So if anybody's going to the webpage, I just.
Yeah, you're first.
Are you already loaded up?
Yeah, this is PDF.
Oh, you did PDF too. Okay.
Oh, that is hard to read, isn't it?
Is there another?
No, I'm trying to get this out of the They're like inspired by. I don't know if they perform. Does it? It's scholar. It's scholar. Yeah, so in particular.
Have you had a chance to talk to him at all?
Oh yeah, we can talk. I got to introduce him.
Targeting employee activities. As far as I can tell, it's basically confused, right? And so, and I know I've been doing it because I'm like, okay, going kind of through the front door to the completely open access stuff. Let's make going through like the screening professor pages, finding random stuff like that's preferred. But it's yeah, right. Yeah, which would not a little bit, but I'd rather just spend more time on what we're good at, which is not fun. And so the hard problem at the end is stuff. Something doesn't have UI number. It doesn't have UI number. It's not archive. It's not in PubMed. It's not in UA, right? So then it's like, okay, is it a paper? How big size? Is it notable? Is it registered to go out? So, but it's just that it's we will almost certainly do that. But it's like that's like I just want to see if other people have already done it. I don't personally. Yeah. That's correct. Letters. That's Robert's fine, but it's not super fast. So it's not very cheap to run. Yeah, well, I mean, okay. Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, it's not well used. Yeah, I think like that card.
I know. I've got it back there in the booth. You can just stop by or I can drop it off. I'll stop by. That's cool.
This is kind of short. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the last session for today. David Miner here from UC San Diego Library. And this session is titled, Are You Going to Preserve That? Curation Choice and Lessons Learned. So as a facilitator, I'm basically just going to get out of the way, and I'll let folks introduce themselves, who they are, what they're going to be talking about. Presentation's about 20-25 minutes, and we will definitely have time for questions afterwards. So, to our first talk.
Hello, I'm Julie Rudder, Repository Program Librarian at UNC Chapel Hill, and this is my colleague Rebecca Cutty, who is our Institutional Repository Librarian. Today we're going to share with you a project that we've been working on to improve our data curation services for research data in our institutional repository, the Carolina Digital Repository, or otherwise known as the CDR. First, I'm going to share with you the results of an exercise that I did with staff from Duke University Libraries about levels or tiers of service for data curation activities. Then Rebecca's going to talk to you about how we use the results of that exercise in the CDR. And then lastly, we're going to talk a little bit about how we are evaluating the Hierarch software as a platform to support data. Currently, the Carolina Digital Repository is a series of custom applications built on top of Fedora 3.8.x. We launched in 2010 as an institutional repository that supports any file type and supports multiple use cases beyond data. This summer, we're migrating to our Hierarch-based institutional repository. So this is a little sneak peek. It's not live yet. It's a screenshot of our dev server. Hierarch is a community-supported software repository application from the Veera community, and Hierarch builds on the work of Sophia and curation concerns, and is a robust and flexible digital repository that is meant to support both IR and digital collections use cases. The CDR will be using, so the CDR is going to use Hierarch as its new platform. So although we have always accepted data in the CDR, until last year we did little in the way to curate those deposits beyond taking what the researcher gave us and trying to add a little bit of descriptive metadata. In other words, we've been treating data very broadly. So why are we wanting to improve our services now? Well, because we all know that there's a growing focus to support open science and for sharing research data that meets certain standards such as the FAIR guiding principles. And with journal and grant requirements around sharing data, we want to help meet the specific needs of researchers, which includes assisting them with policy compliance, increasing the impact and visibility of their research, and facilitating access and reuse of data. In addition, UNC passed an open access policy, and with it came more resources, surprise, and more interest in supporting data. So our repository team has grown and still supports multiple use cases that an IR does plus more, and is now staffed with 4 developers, 2 librarians, including 1 dedicated IR librarian, paraprofessional, and a student. So the library has also increased support for metadata and OA outreach, so a lot of that pressure is taken off of us. So we're in a much better place to do more now. However, we still do not have a data curation librarian who gives time to curate the data that is submitted to the CDR, and we cannot expect an IR librarian to be a data curation librarian on top of everything else they do. So if we are saying we are supporting FAIR data principles and that our repositories support data and that we do data curation, then we need to be able to specifically understand and document how we're doing that. We need to be able to move from a generalized statement of data curation support to a specific and shared data understanding. Thankfully, I was able to dedicate 3 days to learn and think with my great colleagues at Duke through a Triangle Research Libraries Network Institute. And together we produced a white paper, which I will share more about. So I'm gonna be posting some links, and some of this information is dense. So it'd be probably better if you could load the links and look at some of the stuff yourself. And Maura is here. She's one of the co-authors from Duke, and she can answer any Duke questions. And she will also be tweeting some of the links that I mentioned. Okay, so the goal of this exercise was to provide more specificity around data curation within our individual context. Duke and UNC have much different staffing models and service models for data curation in the repository programs, but we both wanted to establish a method to consistently discuss our service models and identify gaps we want to fill and determine what is out of scope. One of the first things we did in our time together was get on the same page with a precise definition of research data curation. In a recent ARL spec kit about data curation, they found that respondents conflated data curation activities with research data management services, and that this indicates that a common understanding of data curation is not widespread or ubiquitous, which I was glad to know it wasn't just me. So if we think about research data management, or RDM, as a broader set of services, we can think about research data curation as the encompassing work and actions taken by curators of a data repository to provide meaningful and enduring access to that data. Okay, so it's important to note that we are specifically talking about the activities performed on the research data that is hosted in our repositories, because that is the data that we're responsible for stewarding. So the group decided to take a really close look at the 47 data curation activities from the Data Curation Network. This is one of those things that I said was really dense, and you probably want to look at it on your laptop. I'm not going to go over all of these. I'm just kind of showing you where we're going with this. So we wanted to think about this as a way to think about our institutional ability to provide these services, because both institutions felt there's no way we could provide all of these activities given our staffing and our resources. So we reflected instead on what we considered to be the most essential activities when faced with limited resources. So the team began to go through a process of grouping these curation activities into 3 distinct levels, as you see here. So basically, we were proposing that there could be 3 levels of data curation services for a repository program. Level 1 is what UNC is currently striving for as a baseline of service. So as I said, we don't have a data curation librarian. We have a self-deposit and mediated deposit system staffed by an IR with many other duties and areas of service. For level 1, we are suggesting that these are the activities here that can be generally supported by the repository system and the repository policies. And this is something that we can aim for. Level 2 curation is the service that Duke is targeting. Level 2 builds on the task outlined in level 1 and also provides a more thorough review and potential enhancement of the data package. We are suggesting that level 2 services could be conducted by library staff with general knowledge about data management and curation best practices, and that these activities could be performed by a data curation librarian without discipline-specific knowledge. Level 3 is even more involved and includes manipulation of data sets and even more specialized services such as data cleaning and code review. This level is for programs that are staffed with people who have specific domain and data type knowledge. I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca.
All right, so I'm going to talk about how we're using the levels in the CDR. So as Julie mentioned briefly, we're targeting level 1 for the CDR service because that seemed to be the most realistic, given that we do not have a data curation librarian and we have, well, me and a paraprofessional doing the work. So to get to a CDR service, I needed to ask myself some pretty key questions about what the service was going to look like. So the questions were, what is the feasibility of getting fair data with our current staffing levels and generalist subject knowledge? We also needed to figure out how much time curating a data set was actually going to take and how many data sets we could curate per month realistically. I also needed to figure out what our sweet spot was and where we could add the most value. So there are several other organizations on campus and in the library that provide data management and data repository services. I do not want to duplicate their work. They're doing fabulous work. There's no reason for us to be doing the same work as they are. They have specialized knowledge. They have the ability to offer level 3 services like visualization. And also they accommodate very different types of data than we do. Our medical school, for example, has HIPAA-protected patient data and all the repository features that go with that. And there is no way that we could duplicate that on our end. So we needed to consider what service we could provide that would be beneficial, but wouldn't directly compete with the campus offerings. We also needed to consider if our new system, HIREX, was good for data. So we have a general idea of what it can do, but we need to figure out if our assumptions were actually correct. We needed to get institutional support and buy-in from our governance group and the library leadership to provide new service. And we also needed to get some training. So what did we do? We got training, created policies, created documentation, new workflow, assessed existing deposits, and evaluated HIREX for data. So I'll go over each of these in turn. So training. So I am not a data management librarian. I have a lot of experience in other aspects of librarianship, but data management is not one of them. So I had to start from square one. So I did a research data management and sharing Coursera course that was essentially Research Data Management 101 that introduced me to a lot of the key concepts and best practices, and there was a really good foundation for these other activities. I did a literature review and looked at best practices and current issues in research data management and curation, also the spec kit and the TRLN white paper. Reviewed existing services and surveyed service offerings from our peer institutions, Michigan and Minnesota, who were especially helpful. Thank you, Michigan and Minnesota, if you're in the audience. And also looked at existing resources at UNC to get a sense of what was already offered. I attended conferences, including the Research Data Access and Preservation Conference, which was really wonderful for this topic, and attended some workshops at UNC in text mining and data and code reproducibility, just to get a sense of what those were about. So this is still an ongoing process. I know I need to learn a lot. I know this is not comprehensive whatsoever, but it provided a pretty good foundation. So I also created a new data policy. And I know this is everyone's favorite thing to talk about at 3:30 in the afternoon, but I'm actually one of those crazy people who likes policies for all of these reasons listed on the slide. It formalizes and documents the service activities. So it defines activities and the levels and the scope of the service by saying which activities we're going to perform and what that's going to look like for the library. As a service manager, that's great. It provides transparency. It also provides documentation that I can refer to if there's ever any questions or if I need to refer somebody to an official document. I have that because I have this policy. We also need a new data policy because large deposits took a long time. So large data sets that are over our storage allocation need to be reviewed by our governance group. The governance group is comprised of managers and high-level people who, as managers and high-level people are, they're very difficult to schedule. And so it just took a long time from that initial request with the depositor to actually get an answer as to whether we were able to accommodate the request. The governance group was also formed to oversee the special collections repository, so they were not used to dealing with data every day, and sometimes the unique needs of data weren't necessarily addressed. We needed a new policy because our data definition was vague. We didn't have a standard definition that was being applied to all reviews. The new policy also created buy-in amongst library leadership. And so they needed to approve the policy for services and staff time. So I looked at examples of data policy from other institutions and did research to see what a good service and data plan looks like. And I also needed to figure out how the data policy was going to align with the IR policy, since the data is going to be living in IR with all of our other materials. So what's in this policy? We have a data definition, which was created by our data management core team. That's a group of librarians who do data management as a part of their jobs. Some members are data specialists, some, like me, deal with data only occasionally. So our data definition, among other things, includes primary, secondary data, structured and unstructured data, born digital, converted to digital. So we hope that it's going to cover pretty much any data set that's submitted. A review of large deposits also goes to that data management core team of librarians. So they review it first, give a recommendation that goes to this governance group, so the unique needs of data are represented within the governance's review process. We are also doing a 10-year review of data sets, also done with the assistance of the data management team, and including the depositor if possible. So our criteria for the retention review is, has it been used? Does it need to be retained to comply with the grant? Does the researcher see it as valuable and important, and is it in an accessible and preservable format? Also creating tombstones to give context and also to comply with FAIR. We're currently doing some local customization work in HIREX to implement this feature based off of work done by Michigan. Thanks, Michigan. I'm going to be doing a submission review, scanning for PII and sensitive info, and making recommendations on open file formats and how maybe they should structure their data. Also going to be creating a DOI for every data submission and customizing our local HIREX to automatically mint DOIs for all content. We're going to be requiring a README or a code book, and we're still in the planning phases of managing replication and fixity for the new system, so it's not currently in the data policy, but we will have it later. So documentation. On the staff side, we formalized our mediated deposit questions just to make sure that we're getting consistent information whenever we talk with depositors. We're also created a new workflow for staff and mediated submission, which I'll talk about in a bit. And I also created a comparison document that contrasted the old policy with the new policy. So that gave our subject specialist an easy way to figure out what had changed. For depositors, we have a data-specific FAQ that will be added to the FAQ page. And we also create a README template. Like many of our peers, we're using a variation on Cornell's README template because it's just that awesome. And we're hoping that providing the template will encourage the depositors to actually use it. So the workflow. Workflow is pretty simple. It starts out when the depositor submits, either via self-deposit or through mediated deposit. And if the deposit's pretty big, it's going to go through that review process I mentioned earlier, but it's not on the workflow document. So once they submit, we'll mint a DOI, we'll verify their contact info, we'll verify that README or other documentation is included. We'll assess the file format to determine if it's an open format. We'll also verify the license. The license options are CC0, CC BY, or no license, and we're going to assign CC0 by default. Also do a PII scan. If PII is present, we'll restrict the visibility of the submission until the depositor addresses it. The default visibility for all of our data submissions is going to be public, but we'll offer embargo institution only or private upon request. After we do all of those actions, I'll email the researcher with a link to the DOI, a link to the data set, and any suggestions for improvement, like please submit the README, please, or and a recommendation on an open format. So you might be asking, okay, that's nice, but how does this all work in practice? So I did an assessment of our existing data deposits to determine the compliance with the new policy and to see if we needed to make any changes. I also tested the scope of the service and the new workflow, and just to figure out what needed to be improved. So the results. We needed READMEs. We only really had, I think we had one data set that actually submitted a README without prompting. Several included robust methodology sections in the metadata, or they referred to separate articles, companion articles, and said, see the methodology section in, my article. That's not good enough. They need to have a README file that stays with the data set. So we'll be contacting them and telling them that they need to do that. They also needed more open formats. Most data sets were Excel documents that could easily be converted to a CSV. And thankfully, most data sets were in a recognizable file format, although we did have one that was just, that was not Googleable. The file extension was not Googleable. I couldn't really tell what it was, so I'm going to talk to our science librarian to see if she can help. But since it's a student work and the students departed, it's unclear as to if any improvements will be made. Thankfully, the bit of good news is that DOIs and license statements are present. So for scope of the service will cover self-deposit, mediated deposit, but we are not going to cover any deposits that get automatically imported as attachments to dissertations or supplemental material to articles. Not only is that going to introduce versioning issues, but we just get way too many of them for one person to deal with. If, of course, if the depositor contacts us before they submit, we are happy to review their submission, but it's not something that we can do after they've already published it. So the new workflow works pretty well and is feasible given that we get about 1 data set per month. But this process did raise some further questions. Specifically, what is good enough for a README file? So as a generalist, I can see if the file's filled out, but I don't really know if it's filled out well. I also need to think more about what to do about file format recommendations for unknown file extensions and what to do if a student has left the university and leaves a messy data set behind. So I'm going to turn it back over to Julie, who's going to talk about HIRAX.
I'm going to talk really fast. I'm going to skip a little bit, but basically, I hope you'll read the white paper, and in one of the statements it says that further work is needed around documenting the baseline capabilities required by our systems and our policies to support fair data principles and data curation. So again, let's be specific about how we're doing that. So in an effort to start this work, I've been working with folks from Duke and others in the Veera community to do a sort of data audit for HIRAX using FAIR principles and the level 1 data curation activities. I'm just going to show you this real quick and then we'll wrap up. So basically this, if you want to open this and use it for yourself, you can go for it, but it basically has all the level 1 activities and all the FAIR data principles, and you could just make yourself a little tab here with your system. And the idea is to basically say, this is how my system addresses this activity or this principle, and this is when a local solution is needed, and this is when a policy is needed. And so hopefully that sort of starts giving us a little bit more specificity of when how to talk about this stuff, and to see that basically it's not just a system, there's a lot of policy and local solution work even so. So let me just give you one example and then I'll wrap up. Okay, so for example, so file validation. So that's one of the curation activities. HIRAX uses FITs to do file characterization, that's such a hard word to say, and validation. So we're good on that. But for, let's say, cease data curation, this is basically that you have to have a tombstone record for a DOI to point to if you decide to remove the data set. So HIRAX doesn't have that. So we would have to have a local solution. And HIRAX is not going to give us migration or secure storage, so that's a local solution that we need to do. So this is just an invitation to sort of help, let's try to do this and be more specific together and start filling this out. A lot of people, since I've been doing this, have been sending me links to related work, so you can see some links there. And then lastly, I feel like there was one more thing I wanted to say, but I'll just open it up for questions.
Great presentation, thank you. I'm curious how you are scanning for PII, and how have you tested that part of your workflow, and why, and just talk a little bit about that.
Currently, we're using bulk extractor to scan for PII upon recommendation from, someone's really excited. I'm glad to hear we have enthusiasm for bulk extractor. It's just recommendation from our records management folks who use it pretty regularly. So they had some instructions to scan for social security numbers, and it scans automatically for some other things. So that's what we're using.
And one of the reasons we decided to do that was because it really doesn't take that much effort for us to scan it, and the risk is a little bit high. And we've been finding that we have been getting social security numbers and stuff that, even though we put all the responsibility on the depositor, we still have that stuff. So I remembered what I was going to say too. The FAIR data principles are hard to quantify, and so I feel validated that when I tried to, I found a lot of other people who had the same problems. So I think more work around that to define what that actually means for systems and work would be really great.
Other questions? What do you consider a large data deposit? Because it's sort of relative.
Our limit right now is 2 terabytes.
Okay.
When we upgrade to the new system, we may adjust that downward. It just depends on what the new system can accommodate.
Do you mean 2 terabytes per file or total?
Total. Faculty get 2 terabytes.
Oh.
And then if they want more, they have to ask us.
Okay. And so so the reason why I ask is, you know, the type of requests I get for data sets are usually immediate. So Friday, it was before lunch, they needed it up because they needed a persistent URL to put in a journal article that referred to it, publisher required it. And so I had it, you know, had to build the package and then get it in by that night. So there's not really time for those 6 steps. So what are your kind of remediation kind of strategies for that type of urgency? Thanks.
That's a good question. It hasn't really been an issue so far. We've had a lot of lead time, so I think that's something we would have to figure out when it happens. I think personally, just right now, I would say that I would probably figure out what their need is and meet that, and then go back later and add other things. If they just needed a DOI, do the bare minimum to meet the DOI, give them the DOI, and then go back later when I had more time.
As I understood that you mentioned that data definition was reviewed, and I think so it was changed. I want to know what new definition you opted, and also I read that supplementary files are not including, you are not hosting it. And as per the data sharing practices, many funders, they are putting embargo on the researchers and the research projects to put whatever, all the data, include it and to share it. Then what about the supplementary files, especially in terms of humanities and social sciences? Thank you.
I actually don't have the data definition memorized because it's really long now. The goal was for it to be specific enough that it was meaningful, but broad enough that we didn't have to say no and rethink everything. And we based it largely off what Duke is using. So you could probably Google Duke data definition and it would probably pop up. The second question was supplemental files. We do take supplemental files. I think what you were maybe seeing was that we are not doing we're not doing the data curation review for supplemental files that we ingest from external sources. We're only doing those from the primary ingest on campus.
We do have a couple other questions, but in the interest of time, maybe we'll move along. So thank you again. And we'll move geographically west from North Carolina to Texas and have presentation from the Texas Digital Library.
All right. Can everybody hear me okay? Good, thank you. So thanks for sticking around for this late afternoon set of presentations. We're excited to be here from Texas Digital Library to talk with you a little bit about an adventure or a series of adventures that we have been engaged with through our digital preservation services that we provide and the 22 academic library members who are part of our consortium. We're going to conceal the true identities of the people that we talk about in this presentation for their protection, but I will introduce us. I'm Christy Park. I'm the Executive Director of the Texas Digital Library, and I'm joined by roughly 1/3 of our staff at TDL today. Courtney Muma, the Deputy Director of the Texas Digital Library, and Nicholas Woodward, one of our senior software engineers. All right, so I'm going to start with a little bit of backstory to this adventure. TDL was formed in 2005 among 4 ARL libraries in Texas and has since grown to 22 academic library members across the state, representing a pretty broad cross-section of research libraries, small and large, parts of systems, independent, private liberal arts institutions, et cetera, who pool their resources in us to build shared infrastructure for preserving, managing, and providing access to unique digital collections of enduring value. Among other things, we host institutional repositories for these institutions. We host a consortial research data repository, open access journals, and electronic thesis and dissertation management tools. And since about 2015, we have hosted or provided digital preservation storage services as well. Currently, we run our own instance of DuraCloud in Amazon. We're one of the only, I think, open source installations of DuraCloud outside of DuraSpace's installation. And this serves as the gateway and management console for a number of preservation storage options, including the Digital Preservation Network and Chronopolis, and some commercial Amazon storage options as well. We operate nodes in Texas for both DPN and Chronopolis. Those are both using storage resources at the Texas Advanced Computing Center at the University of Texas at Austin. We encourage our members to choose cultural heritage community-based Chronopolis and Deepen over the Amazon offerings, but we have those available to folks if they want them. Ours is the first and I think still only consortial DPN membership. We fought hard for that so that our less resourced members that are part of TDL will have access to this important resource for preserving the scholarly record. So this is a pretty high-level view of the workflow for getting content into our digital preservation storage. We have that single ingestion interface via DuraCloud with a number of storage options for digital preservation storage, each of them with their own strengths, their own business models, their own succession models. So we have this plethora of options for digital preservation storage available to our members and 22 potential institutional users of these services, each with a unique set of use cases and challenges that they're dealing with in making decisions about digital preservation and executing on their digital preservation strategies. And so there are a lot of different paths to take here. And one of our challenges since we launched some of these services and have been growing these services since 2015 has been helping members use them effectively. We found a lot of paralysis in our membership in terms of prioritizing, making decisions about what content goes into digital preservation storage and actually creating workflows for doing that. And so in February of last year, we hired Courtney, who came to us with a rich background in digital preservation and community building to help our members navigate this sea of options and the range of options available to them and to choose their own digital preservation adventure using the resources available. So I'm going to hand it over to Courtney now to go through some of those various adventures that some of our members have gone on.
Thanks. Howdy, everybody. So I get to tell 4 stories, and these are digital preservation storage stories. I'll give the same disclaimer that Christy offered. The institution names are changed and use cases have been combined in order to reflect the variety of issues we have in Texas. However, if you pull us aside later, we'll still tell you who they are if you're interested in any particular workflow, because we like sharing. So the first story I want to tell is about that institutional paralysis that Christy just mentioned, and this is the institution that made perfect its enemy. So this is an institution that would say to me things like this, lots of negative self-talk. We need to do a full track audit before we start, and if you're not familiar with track, that's Trusted Repositories Audit and Certification. It's quite detailed. Our digital preservation strategy is non-existent. We're still stuck in the 90s technologically at my university. We only have 3 full-time staff, and they only have 0.1% of their time dedicated to digital preservation, maybe. IT in our institution doesn't think that we need anything else for digital preservation. They think we're doing just fine. So in order to address this, and understanding that I needed a way to communicate that TDL members don't have to do all the things at once or necessarily in a particular order towards digital preservation needs. I just wanted to help them see what they had already accomplished and also understand what was possible. So I introduced these Texas levels of preservation, what we call too lovingly as TexLOP at the Texas Digital Library, at the DLF Forum in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in October of last year. And what this does is applies the NDSA levels of preservation framework at the state level in Texas to observe and magnify Texas institutions' digital preservation efforts, and then also inspire them to work towards more shared goals where they all might be struggling equally. So beyond the 5 accepted functional areas of storage, integrity, security, metadata, and file formats, I followed the example of Hull University Archives and included 2 extra areas that have been proposed and might actually end up included if the new approaches to NDSA result in adding them, and those are access and physical formats. This slide illustrates where Texas institutions fall in the 4-level framework, which I intend to use to guide collaborative efforts in Texas and then to revisit annually. The ability to be able to see at a glance how an institution is faring in its digital preservation efforts and what should be our collective next set of goals together is an incredibly useful tool for distributing shared resources. TexLOP, or the Texas Levels of Preservation, breaks down these confusing terms and stages of digital preservation into these smaller points that are more manageable chunks for understanding, making it easier for institutions to begin implementing their own digital preservation strategies. So the next story I want to tell you is a story of an island of time, stranded content. This story is about the kind of institution that has content in 1 or 2 places. Their published content might be in peril because it only exists, for instance, in digital commons and maybe on local shared drives. So what really they need is a backup functionality, and an institution like this might choose to use Glacier through our digital preservation storage services. I have to be willing, despite my own experience in digital preservation and my experience in doing really deep dive peer track audits, I have to be willing to accept that the only way we're going to get under-resourced, smaller institutions' collections preserved, at least partially, is if we just do something and not let paralysis get in the way. If all they can do is back it up in Glacier, TDL wants to support them in doing so without judgment. Another story I want to tell you is the story of searching for a place to put the treasure. This is about an institution with loads of content, with some digital preservation workflows and a good understanding of digital preservation in general, but nowhere to put their stuff, nowhere to preserve it. They might have content in DSpace, for instance, and replicated on local storage. They might have special collections in Content DM. They might choose something like Chronopolis. And then in doing so, they might partner with us to help to adapt an already existent workflow that DSpace Direct has to get DSpace content into DuraCloud so that they can get their DSpace content into our DuraCloud at TDL and then onto Chronopolis. And finally, the last story I want to tell you is about the institution with all the magic beans, and it's my favorite because I love this little jelly bean with the magic wand. This example, of course, represents the most well-resourced institutions who are involved in multiple internal digital preservation projects. They're quite sophisticated. They may be involved with multiple digital preservation grants, and they have a lot of technological and human resources. They might also have quite a lot more funding than many of our other member institutions. This institution might have content on shared drives, but they might also have a homegrown system that they've created to manage some particular set of content that they don't feel fits necessarily in something like DSpace or Content DM. But then they also might have a DSpace implementation for other content in their library. They could have Archivematica, so they might have a sophisticated workflow for creating metadata packages for digital preservation and for transforming their local content. And they might also have a homegrown metadata engine for digitized content, for instance. This institution, maybe they'll choose the Digital Preservation Network, and they might partner with us not only to use that network and have us support them in doing so, but we would consult with them to help them align all those different local workflows that they have with all those different systems and help them figure out what metadata and how to build that package properly to put into digital preservation network. And you see that's much more sophisticated than just sending content directly into something like Glacier. So all of those illustrate all the different kinds of choices our institutions can make. Obviously, we've combined a lot of the use cases to make it a little bit more understandable. I've done a few things in the first year that I was with TDL, in fact, in the first few months, to kind of help people make those choices. One of the things I did was create this content inventory and prioritization spreadsheet. It's a tool I've developed from my own work when I was at Artifactual Systems and helping to build Archivematica, and I would work with institutions to help them figure out how to manage their content using that system. I've also combined that with input from Grant Hurley's work for Scholars Portal in supporting his users there, and in AVP's Digital Preservation Network Digital Preservation Workflow curriculum. So all of those have been munged together to create this handy-dandy Google spreadsheet in which our users can just grab it from Google, use it locally, change it if they want to help first inventory what they have and where, real basically, and then prioritize it using some kind of scale that they adapt for their own institution. Another thing I've done is create this deceptively simple table on our website. And basically, it just helps to distinguish some of the main things that differentiate our storage options. So the first thing I do is make it clear that Chronopolis and Deepin are both non-commercial and they're rooted in our cultural heritage community. Whereas, of course, Amazon S3 and Glacier options are the commercial options. The table also describes the geographic distribution of all of the different options. Chronopolis and Deepin are both distributed across multiple nodes, all across, geographically distributed across the United States, 3 each in particular. Whereas Amazon S3 and Glacier options, they offer distribution as defined by Amazon, but that distribution is in just that one data center. So it's a big difference between what we can offer with the Chronopolis and Deepin options. The last part of the table describes the file fixity and data integrity elements for all of these options. Chronopolis offers not only hashes, but also they use something called ACE for auditing, and it has tokens, which are another way for checking integrity over time. Deepin has fixity checking as well. All of our options include the DuraCloud at TDL integrity checking, because we do that on ingest, of course. And then I did my best to clarify with our Amazon partners. I spent a lot of time talking to Amazon trying to figure out exactly what they do. And the most information I could find is that they do some combination of MD5 hashes and cyclic redundancy or CRC checks with unspecified regularity on upload and whenever they move the content around. And that's really the best answer I got. The other thing that I do, that I did in the first year was make sure that all of our pricing was online and available. So it's all broken down online and open and available for everyone to look at so they know exactly how much it would cost them to store an amount of content. And excuse me, and I also do my best to describe to them, for instance, that Deepin and Chronopolis also have differences. So Deepin, for instance, or the Digital Preservation Network, commits to 20 years of preservation storage, even if your institution, for whatever reason, can no longer support that material. Other nodes will support it at least up to that 20-year point. Deepin is also endowed, but then I also like to distinguish that Chronopolis has been around for over 10 years, whereas Deepin has been around for less than 5 years so far. And so I just present that information so that my institutions in Texas can make those decisions on their own in an informed way with our support. And once they make those decisions, we try to help them and walk them through the actual technical process of ingest. which I'm now going to hand over to Nicholas Woodward to talk about how that goes technologically.
True story, DuraCloud and the Four Paths is an actual title of a Choose Your Own Adventure book written 40 years ago. Please don't write that down. So once our members are ready for long-term storage preservation, we begin by discussing with them a few of the key factors that they'll want to consider before making any decisions about what to do with their data. First, what is it that they want to store long-term? This response is unique to every institution, and it has to do with the cultural heritage collections and research data and other digital objects that they want to preserve long-term. Second, and we'll get into this more in a minute, but where do they want to store their data? This decision can impact several key factors such as cost and the time it would take to retrieve that data. Third, how do they want to package their data before it is preserved? Will it be in DSpace's MET-spaced AIP format, or the Bagot specification based on the Library of Congress? And how much information, such as the folder hierarchy, do they want reflected when the data is stored? And finally, do they have some sort of schedule in mind for when they want to push their data to DuraCloud? The process could be done on a quarterly basis or on a per collection basis as they come in, or even automatically if the data is already in DSpace using the replication task suite. This is a screenshot of the sync tool developed by DuraSpace. Apologies for the size, but the gist is that it allows users to push their content into DuraCloud. It shows them the file list, the progress of the process, and if there are any errors during that syncing process. And once the data is in DuraCloud, users can see that it's there. They get file counts, file size counts. They can see data over time, and they can also download manifests and audit logs to know that their data is present and all the actions that have occurred on that data. And as we've already mentioned, we have 4 options for long-term storage preservation. In the case of Deepin and Chronopolis, members push their content to DuraCloud, at which point they can snapshot their spaces. So DuraCloud functions as a way station for that data as it goes into Deepin or Chronopolis. The current limit for our node is 250 gigabytes per space, though we are working to increase that limit to better conform with Deepin's workflows. The data is then replicated across 3 geographically distinct nodes for long-term storage.
I'm just back for 2 slides. I think this is the best picture actually in the deck. I think it beats the jelly bean. So this one we're calling a light on Burrow Mountain because Nick really wanted us to use that title. And it's really kind of our next steps slide. So this is what we're thinking about for the next several years, supporting our members' content challenges that are still kind of being addressed by the digital preservation community writ large. Things like private, personal, and confidential information, for instance, because right now we don't accept any of that into any of our digital preservation storage options. Temporary content, so content for which maybe it's research data that is required to be stored for 7, 10, 15 years, but once that retention is up, it doesn't necessarily need to be stored anymore. So how do we address that using our digital preservation storage options? And finally, embargoed data. So if there is content that needs to be preserved that they can't yet provide access to, but they need to keep it somewhere and don't want it on their servers, how are we going to deal with that, and how can we support them in creating those workflows? And that's all we had to present today. We were trying to really just give you an overview of how we're trying to manage this in Texas right now. We want to thank our digital preservation services members. These are the folks whose stories have been munged together for all of the stories we told you today. And then, of course, both Nick and I have our Twitters here, although neither of us are very active there, but feel free to talk at us and we'll probably answer you. But now I think we can take questions if you have any. Thank you.
Oh, hi. Look, I just have a question about the fixity and the checking. It says it checks it, but do you know what it does if there's a problem? Like, do they have statements around what the reaction is if something's?
Each of the different, so Chronopolis and Deepin have statements for how they deal with it, and we just follow along with their policies in those cases. And we haven't run into any problems so far because the first big Deepin integrity check is due this September. That's coming so far. And for Chronopolis, in that case, so far we have 2 members who have signed on to use Chronopolis, but they are not yet ready to ingest. And so we haven't put their stuff in yet. So that's kind of where we are on those.
Hi, thank you for this. It's very interesting. So I'm wondering if you guys have any partners that are on the that are experiencing the very large data volume story, and if so, what is the path that they might end up taking?
I can take that because we're really only seeing that in our Texas data repository. And so we have a Dataverse installation in Texas that's shared among 11 Texas data repository users, so they each have their own institutional Dataverse, but it's limited to very small data content. And so one of our challenges there, which I actually get to talk about Thursday morning, if you want to come to that panel, they're all struggling with having very, very large data sets. And we haven't really come up with a strategy for that yet. And I think the Dataverse community writ large is also trying to deal with that right now. But in terms, do you want to talk about TAC a little bit?
Yeah, I'll just add, we do have one member that I can think of who has a huge cultural heritage collection that they need preserved, and the current options that we have available are not very feasible for them. But there are, part of the benefit of working within these communities like Chronopolis and Deepin is that those communities are working on these problems together rather than us having to solve them alone. So Deepin, for instance, is making strides towards being able to provide affordable options for institutions that have those large collections. So I think that's how we're approaching it, is working within those communities to solve them together.
Hi, I have a question. So when an institution decides that they want, their data distributed in 2 options, do you check the differences between the copies in one option and in the other option as they aggregate, and if there are inconsistencies of the same?
Doer Cloud includes a JSON policy creator for replicating content across 2 different storage providers. So if they do want their S3 and Glacier or S3 and Deepin, S3 and Glacier, data to be the same, then the policy will act on any file that's uploaded to one and send it to the other automatically. And from there, we do bit integrity reports on both spaces and make sure that the spaces match.
Time for one last question. Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
I guess we will continue our own adventure journey west, ending up at Stanford in California with Art Pasquinelli.
Thanks, David. Hi, everybody. Thanks for attending the last session. So I guarantee it won't go over a half hour. I'm going to be talking about locks, but before I do that, I want to say thank you to Montana State University for these wonderful rooms and logistics and everything. It's a lot of work to put these on, and I do appreciate it. And also the committee that set open repositories up. Thank you very much. So here I focus very much on the sustainability issues involved in locks, which is locks of copies keep stuff safe. Have you all heard of locks in the past? Okay, it's been around for years. It started in 1999. So I'm building off a lot of experience that a lot of you have already. I'm going to go into the locks background very quickly. Then I want to spend some time on our community focus because it is a very community-directed, community-active organization, and Stanford is a technology hub. We then will get into the technical re-architecture that we're doing around web services, and then I'm going to point out some collaboration opportunities, and then lessons being learned, which I hope will hit home with a lot of you. So lots of copies keep stuff safe. I think we know that. We all accept it. It's a proven and widely accepted principle for digital preservation. You know, we often need to look at it a little bit deeper than just amount of copies. And Locks does that by taking a distrustful model of the content. But we'll get into that. Locks is even more than the technology, probably an international community of institutions and networks. So we have hundreds of institutions in over a dozen networks, and it's really a lot of the innovation and sharing between those that I'll be talking about. And that's probably one of the key things that Locks brings to the preservation community. Lastly, it's a program of Stanford Libraries, so we sit in Stanford. So when I talk about communities, it's a highly community advised program. Okay, it's not community driven there as far as a very formal structure of direction, but it is highly advised by our community of Locks networks. Locks originated with e-journals. So it set out, Vicki Reich and David Rosenthal set out to build a journal preservation system, you know, permanent content access, PCA systems. And very quickly it evolved into a generic digital preservation core. Organizations such as MetaArchive and COPOL picked it up. We do a lot in the area of government document preservation in Canada and the United States. CLOCKS is the controlled locks network that the publishers and major libraries work together on to preserve published content. And that is actually track certified. So each one of these different communities sets its own goals, its own governance models, and its own success. It sets its own standards for success. So when we talk about Locks, Locks is a connection of these communities, but each one is very independent. Getting into Locks, it's more than lots of copies. Lots of copies is necessary but not sufficient. So as I mentioned, you have Locks being pulled in different nodes. And a node, you know, in the past we used to say 6 to 7 nodes keeps content safe, especially if it's distributed widely geographically. Most of our Locks networks today, not all, but most, are probably around 4 or 5 nodes. So we have seen a change coming as far as lead nodes servicing a broader community of people in their own Locks network. Central points of failure can undermine all copies at once. We all have seen choke points. That can be a person or it can be a technology. It can be on ingest or it can be taking content out of a repository. Don't underestimate people making mistakes, data and media migrations, attacks on information, and organizational failure. I dealt a lot, coming out of the tape world, I dealt a lot with tape and disc, with disasters that occurred, and they usually occurred around migrations of content. So people often make mistakes, media is often mishandled, but that was what we were always worried about when we were going out and advising customers when I was at Sun Microsystems and Oracle. Moving data creates a lot of mishaps. Something else, organizational failure. While we often talk about these knowledge institutions having a long-term view and history, hundreds of years in some cases, well, our projects don't really last hundreds of years. So I think we often overlook the social aspects of organizational failure. Again, funding comes in, funding goes away. And that also happens with companies. So as we talk about things like the cloud, the public cloud, we have to keep that in mind. Coming from Sun Microsystems, Silicon Graphics, and Fairchild, things 20 years down the road are very different. LOX provides a framework of mutually distrusting independent peers. So it is a peer-to-peer network. If you want 3 peers, you can do it. If you want 8 peers, you can do it. You, as a community, set the delimiters of what you want based on the level of preservation you want. It pulls very deliberately. So if we see something, if there's a detection of tampering, you can see it, and it goes in a deliberate, I won't say slow manner, I'll say a deliberate manner, so that you can actually see and fix when tampering, if you see conscious tampering, so it is tamper evident. The fixity is built into that same polling mechanism. So again, fixity is done by polling each of the different nodes in the system to verify the data. I want to look a little bit at communities. That is a central focus because our innovation really comes not just from Stanford, but from the key community innovators that we work with. Preservation is an active community effort, so we definitely look at preservation as a series of decisions, a series of strategies, even within each LOX network, not just each one, but connected in totality. We enable preservation of the content your community cares about. So you really determine the level of security, the level of sharing and access you want. And again, we always talk about preservation. It really is permanent access. I'm building on a lot of what the TDL presentation was about. You set the levels of preservation you want. You set the governance. Some of our LOX networks have very light governance. They have just a very easy way to communicate between the nodes. They have a light governance structure. Others have a full preservation offering, like a meta archive or a COPL. Lots of communities keep stuff safe. The fact that the communities are always talking to each other, and we do have annual meetings, we have regular conference calls, assures that a community that's wondering about something or thinking about taking a new tack has someone to talk to regarding best practices or things that have been done before. We recently had our annual meeting, annual LOX meeting, and all the major LOX networks came in. And I wanted to, we really analyzed what are the core things we need to focus on for sustainability. LOX sustainability hinges on growth and value. Okay, I think every project, reverberates along these lines. But LOX networks, the totality of the community, offer growth. So we're adding on new institutions within the communities all the time. Secondly, innovation equals value. If there's no innovation going on in a project, the value would diminish. And we've seen that with projects we've all been on. This is a very long-standing, healthy project compared to some that we've all been involved in the past. but we do see that innovation equals value. Innovation derives from the collaboration between the networks. If our networks did not talk, we would not be able to do the innovation that would really be needed to get to a next status in this whole program. Innovation also comes from new developers. So what we're doing with the web services re-architecture is we're also looking for new use cases and developers to pull in and set up new LOX networks and also work with the existing LOX networks on value-added integrations. We also want some of the integrations and value-added work that's being done by the LOX networks to be vetted by broader preservation and repository users. So looking at the LOX re-architecture that I'll talk about in the next slides, putting it into a digital preservation landscape, I think it links into some of the presentations that have gone before. But local and decentralized data custody is, in my view, more important now than ever. Expanding volumes of data need to be preserved, okay, especially now that we're talking about research, we're talking about audiovisual materials, we're talking about supplemental materials to journals. Everything is getting more complex and varied. There's sensor data coming in. I was just at the Mass Storage Conference in Santa Clara, and the amount of nuanced data that is coming in from things like the square kilometer array or the UK or the European Weather Organization is amazing, and it's extremely varied. Cost pressures on digital preservation, we all know that. Preservation's hard to do, and it's expensive, and it's out of the range of many of the institutions we talk to. That's why I'm a big believer in communities. Lead institutions can support the smaller institutions that just do not have the money for the manpower they need. Person power, pardon me. More diverse digital preservation user community. That's what I'm trying to say there is that there are people in archives, people in historical societies, people in state government that we talk to that need help from lead institutions at places like Preservation Archive Special Interest Group, NDSA, Open Repositories. Not everybody has the design capability and developer capability that is in this room. And interoperability is a key to success. We've been talking more and more about repository interoperability. I actually see that as part of our work that we're doing. You know, the web services is one part, but it really gets us to the end of being setting up an interoperable technology base. So we call the re-architecture that we're doing LAWS. LOX architected as web services. This was Mellon funded, and it's really aimed at de-siloing and enabling external integrations. We need more people developing with, on LOX technology. With our technology, we're using standard, Docker technology to develop, but we're going totally with standards in the development of this project. We're fostering a larger developer community within the LOX community overall and beyond. And we'll talk to commercial companies, we'll talk to nonprofit companies, but we do want to set up an ecosystem of developers to work and talk together. The more people working with LOX technology, the more sustainable it will be. God, who is that? That was horrible because I hate my voice. I just hate it. And so we capitalize on work of broader communities. So linking into open repositories, linking into NDSA, Preservation Archive Special Interest Group, being able to go around and link our communities into those is very important. We want to foster system enhancements, and we want to evolve with web and digital preservation ecosystems. So the web has really evolved since the early static web pages that LOX used to work with, and being in front of that is one of the goals we have with this web services re-architecture. We're conserving and extending the existing functionality. So LOX has a complicated, not a complicated, but a very well-developed structure of plugins. We will maintain that capability. We will keep servicing all the LOX networks and all the work they do, so the functionality will stay up to date. But we're re-architecting major components as web services, so they'll all be RESTful APIs around all the functions of our system. We're going to better incorporate LOX community innovations. LOXomatic, Mark Jordan has done a lot at Simon Fraser University. So we're depending on LOXomatic to do a lot of the connections to like Islandora and the different repository products and solutions in the community. We're doing a workload monitor dashboard. We're trying to put more GUI functions in, but a lot of it is just enhancing, how the network works, and that's being developed within the LOX community, not Stanford. We are looking at hybrid on-prem public cloud models. So as everybody starts working with AWS or Google, yes, LOX can work with public cloud, but it does active polling of the nodes. So as the economics come through, yes, it's quite capable technically to do that. And we're looking for people who maybe want to have part on-prem, part cloud operations. Pardon me. Lead node enhancements. What we have seen is an evolution. So again, the idea of 7 nodes, I think, has gone away, especially if you look at some of the big data producers today. Most of our organizations have 4, possibly 5 nodes, but we are looking at having node enhancements to really analyze. Maybe we can do things with 3 nodes and focus more on checksumming, for instance. And we want to allow simplified sharing. It's important to share all these components. The key component and its features and benefits is really the content audit protocol. So that is the polling feature. So it goes out, the peers are not trusted. And I know from experience in the past, I used to deal a lot with NetApp sprawl or EMC sprawl of disk. And when people have, even though you have many copies, there's 2 things that happen. When you have a virus or a problem, it just spreads. So you have 5 systems all with the same problem. And what people didn't always know, they were equating preservation with backup. And so preservation, you're really saving the copy, okay? But what they didn't realize was they had 5 copies and they were also paying software licensing fees on each one of those copies, okay? This is, LCAP is not that, it's pure preservation. So it's peer-to-peer, and that will be a separate component that we will offer to any consortia, anybody who wants to use it. We're looking for people to also incorporate it. If DEPN, TDL, AP Trust wanted to use it, this will all be open source and available in the fall. And we're talking to a lot of people already. We have a repository service to, again, do things like prototype cloud interface. We have metadata extraction. And we're working on a harvesting framework. Again, we want non-web harvest LOX ingest. We want a better LOX web harvesting capability that we already have. We're enhancing that. On-access format migration. So we'll complement emulation services for born digital content. I think that is really going to take off in the next, probably the next 18 months. So we've been talking about it for years and years, but I can actually see some movement going on now. I'm very interested in the stuff that the Software Preservation Network is doing, for instance. Discovery via metadata, so that will just improve the discovery of scholarly publications on the web, and that's some of the strength that LOX is building from. The collaborative scenarios around content, we're just looking at these different things, web archiving, We'll deal with any type of community content, and we're looking at maybe an option where we just have checksumming in a LOCKSS network to assure security and preservation for things like audiovisual, where you may only have 2 copies, or research where you may only have 1 copy, and we're talking petabytes. But yes, we're looking at any ideas from the public on that. Lessons being learned. I went in, I didn't really want to focus too much on technology. I wanted to hit the social aspects of things, but yeah, redesigns take a long time. So, you can plan and plan, but they always take longer. And our, part is the development effort, but something we're seeing is it's also the documentation. So people do want to collaborate, and then, it's like, oh, well, here's GitHub, have fun. Open web services components are creating many new discussions. We need to prioritize, so there's a lot of opportunity, but we're not always technically ready internally to discuss everything with people who want to partner with us, and there are a lot of people coming to us. Careful consideration for traditional functionality. We are maintaining our traditional functionality, but growing out of that. We need to have an easy entry and ramp up for new developers. Okay, so the focus is really getting more people playing with the LOCKSS code, and it's very important to us. We want an ecosystem. We want LOCKSS to be servicing the community, and I think we're on our way. I know we'll be on our way in the fall, but now is probably the time to be talking and having collaborative conversations. Some of the leaders of the LOCKSS community are in the room, but we're systematically connecting our leaders. We have an advisory committee now. We have a software developer group, which we hadn't had. There was always good communication, but I think we've enhanced it. We're amplifying the leaders' directions, innovations, issues within the LOCKSS discussions. We have monthly calls, and we're soliciting feedback constantly from our, hundreds and hundreds of people on our LOCKSS mail list. Many people have similar interests, but they don't know it. And it isn't until you get people in a room or on a conference call that they realize it. And one thing to realize, and this is something I've always felt true in my discussions with the Preservation Archive Special Interest Group that David and Courtney are involved with. Not everybody wants to be a leader. People just want to do things simply. Okay, so some people want to develop it on their own. Not everybody does. So you have to allow for that model. Leverage community leaders in the preservation repository arenas. Well, incorporate best practices and developments from better resource communities. Not everybody has the same resources, and we're seeing that's why some of our LOCKSS networks are developing into a node, a super node framework where you have developers and resourced institutions supporting other institutions, as Courtney was talking about. There are institutions who just want to join in and save stuff, okay? I know Archivum talks to a lot of people who just want to put things into preservation as easily as they can, as quickly as they can. And secondly, I think the presentation just before me was great. People want to hear stories, and they want to hear from practitioners. So a lot of what we're doing in the LOCKSS community now is really, the monthly calls we have are great because you go out and these people are talking to the other people who are interested, and they're telling stories and practical experiences and mistakes, and that's what everybody wants to learn from. That's one of the best things I think about joining the LOCKSS community. I think I ended just on time. So I hope this was enjoyable for everybody. And as the last speaker, thanks for staying.
Great. Thank you. So questions?
And I have a poster if you just want to talk one-on-one.
Hey, Art. Oh. Is it on? Oh, okay. Yes, how are you gathering your user stories? How and where are you gathering those?
Basically, we've been going through each of the LOCKSS communities, and they've been great. So, you know, if I call PKP or Copal or SafeNet, I say, can you talk? And then they jump. They want to share what they're doing. And secondly, the other thing is this community has been great because in other speaking engagements like at Elidi that we had in Slovakia, Anthony Leroy, I presented 15 minutes, but Anthony Leroy, one of our LOX network leaders, he spoke for a 3-hour workshop. And they want to tell people what they're doing. And in many cases, you know, I've been at LOX less than a year. There's 14, 15 years experience using LOX. So there's an experience base we had to pull out. So that's how we're doing it. And then we keep the calls and very simple things. We have monthly calls where you have the slides and anybody can access it. It's not just LOX people. So email me if you want to be on the LOX newsletter and the monthly call list. So it's fairly simple.
Any other questions? Last call.
I'll be over there, you guys.
Okay.
Probably with a drink in my hand. Will we have drinks?
Wouldn't be Art without it. Okay, so thanks
guys.
Thanks to Art and to all our presenters. It was a great session, and thank you to everyone for lasting through a long day. So I think we have about a 10-minute break or so, and then the crowds will come flooding back in here to look at posters and eat things. So again, thank you very much.